I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the virtual 6th annual Academic Convivium, our MXCC's very own research fair. This is always my personal favorite day here at MXCC because I think it's really special watching our students showcase their work in what is a really legit academic conference setting, and watching everyone else get to learn from that work. So I'm really glad that you joined us today, even though this is obviously a less than ideal format in which to do this. So today we're going to hear 13 oral presentations by our honor students. These are students who are either presenting their honors capstone projects or students who were in my honors psychology course last fall and completed original research projects as part of that course. They've produced some really interesting, important research, so I think you'll enjoy learning about it. I want to acknowledge the presenters because they have been extraordinarily flexible and patient as the plan for how we were going to make today happen changed way more times than it should have had to. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Rich and Todd for a lot of time and effort that they spent trying to help identify the best platform for doing this and for ensuring that today kind of goes as smoothly as possible. Before I tell you how this is going to work from a technology standpoint and get things rolling, I want to hand the program over to CEO Dr. Minkler. He wants to welcome you and say a few words.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be with you, even if it's virtual. I mean, I think that the one thing that we all miss is having the presence that we have with each other when we're normally on campus. So I'm pleased, at least through technology, that we're able to have this time together and to hear the fruits of your research. As Dr. Levy said, this is the most exciting time of year for all of us at the college. I expressed some of that in an email I sent college-wide yesterday. Just, this is what it's all about, is to celebrate you all as students and the work that you do, and to think about what's lies in store for you in the future, whether you are transferring to get your bachelor's degree and maybe a master's or a doctorate beyond that, or enter the work world, or some combination of both. So this actually is our 6th annual Convivium. We started this originally inspired when we developed the honors program a few years ago, thinking that the Convivium would be a place where the honors students would present their capstone projects, which is what you all are doing. We had opened it up to all students in the past, and hope to continue that tradition in the future when we are back on campus. And Middlesex is one of only a couple of community colleges in Connecticut that have an event like this. So this makes us kind of special in a way of allowing you to present your research and the projects you've worked on, and to celebrate that in a very public way. So I'd like to thank Dr. Levy for her role as director of the Convivium and co-coordinator of the honors program, and for really establishing a culture of research and academic excellence. And it's certainly something that she represents in her professional life. And it's something that she really tries to instill in all of you as students, but then also in her colleagues, to have high academic standards and to really reach for the stars when it comes to what we're all capable of in our academic pursuits. I also want to congratulate I think I counted 18 of you who are doing presentations. Some of you are in small groups. I'm really excited to see what you have to offer. I know a few of you I've spoken to directly, and we've talked informally or in radio shows about your work. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to offer. And I'd like to echo Dr. Levy's thanks to Todd Levesque and Professor Rich Lenosi, who are the wizards behind making all this happen. So the Convivium, as you know, is meant to simulate, and actually not simulate, it actually is an annual research symposium where our students can share their work with the public. Being a conference setting, it's where you're rewarded in your pursuit of knowledge and to gain experience and confidence in your presentation skills, which are challenging even more using the technology that we're using today. So at the same time, you also have the opportunity to learn from each other and support the work of your fellow students. So I'm really excited about seeing what you have to offer and to continue this tradition of having an academic showcase at the college. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Levy.
Thank you so much. So a couple business items before we get started. So as you've probably discovered, you are all muted and your video is turned off. And that is not because I don't want to see your beautiful faces. It is because the video is off to try to minimize any bandwidth issues that we might have with a lot of people in on the same Zoom call. I will obviously turn on the video and audio for each presenter when it is their turn. If you will do a Q&A at the end of each presentation, if you have a question for a presenter, you can either raise your hand if you click on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, a white bar will come up on the right and you'll see a little option to click raise your hand, or in the chat, you can just like type call on me or something and I will call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, I think that's all the business. So let's get rolling. So I want to introduce our first presenters. Oh, well, the other thing I wanted to say is I apologize ahead of time if it's a little clunky with the unmuting and the muting and the starting videos and stopping videos. But we are limited with the technology to some extent. Okay, so our first presenters, Tavish Ernst and Adam Gomez, who are going to present their project called Assessing Students' Perception of the Negative Effects of Smartphone Use. So let's see, Tavish is unmuted and Adam is now unmuted. So if you guys want to go ahead, good, share your screen, fabulous.
Alrighty, can everyone hear me?
You're good.
Yeah, alrighty. So Adam and I, along with a couple other group members, we decided to do a research study about assessing students' perceptions of the negative effects of smartphone use. So we're going to get right into it, starting with the why. All right, so as we all know, technology and smartphones have advanced exponentially over the past few decades, basically becoming a necessity and essential to our lives. A survey conducted last year found that 81% of all adults and 96% of young adults aged 18 through 26 owned a smartphone. The amount of time that we spend on these phones and these devices are also very important. A study of university students found that students usually spend 5 hours a day on their phone and check them about 28 times a day. And this is due to the phone's versatility. Obviously, we use them to message, call, take photos, and access the internet. But with that said, there are a number of negative effects that has been backed by research in different studies. Included in this is worsened posture and ocular health, as well as sleep-related issues, lower grades, increased absent-mindedness, and task proficiency following a smartphone notification is decreased, as well as when the smartphone is just present. So it's important for us to understand these risks in order for us to make decisions about how we're going to use these devices within our own lives. So there's also the idea of optimism bias. And it's important to understand this because users' perceptions of these risks could be distorted by what's called optimism bias. It's a tendency for people to underestimate one's personal risk of experiencing a negative event and compared to others, and they experience that event lower than the general population. So for an example, people would say having a heart attack, getting divorced, or developing alcoholism, or even contracting COVID-19, their chance of getting that is less than the general population. And this could distort smartphone users' perception of risk. So our goal thought to increase our understanding of college students' awareness of these negative effects, and then hopefully determine the degree to which optimism bias influences their perception of these negative effects of smartphone use. We hypothesized that students would not be aware of the negative effects, and students would underestimate their personal susceptibility compared to the general population. So how did we do this? We sent out an anonymous survey to the entire MXCC student body, in which 223 students responded. There were no incentives offered, so people just did it at their own free will. You were not forced to complete the survey. And the survey assessed participants' perceptions of how the general population is affected by smartphones, and then it also gauged how they were affected personally by smartphone usage. So the survey looked something like this. It named all of these negative effects, and if you thought that the statement was true, you would check the box. So for an example, if you thought that people's eye health was worsened due to smartphone use, you would check that, and so on and so on. After that, we had the effects for themselves personally, and it was the same exact questions, and except for themselves. If they thought that, for example, their grades were lowered due to their smartphone use during class, they would check that as it was true for them. But in order to kind of make sure that people didn't just mindlessly check off boxes left and right and complete the survey quickly, we included a couple of dummy answers to ensure that participants paused to consider their response. Included in this were worsened hygiene and decreased sex drive, which we found were not substantiated by any research at all. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my partner, Adam, to complete the rest of the presentation.
All right, hello everybody, I'm Adam Gomez and I'll take it from here. Let me just share my screen. All right, so I'll begin with the demographics of the participants of our study. So as you can see, there was a large majority, almost 3/4 of participants were female and Caucasian. As for age, we had about an average of 26, and given that we're a community college, quite a wide age range from 16 to 67. It's about in line as far as age goes with the general Middlesex population. Now, we compiled the results of our study into a nice bar graph here. So on the x-axis, we have each of the different negative effects of smartphone use. On the y-axis, we have the percentage of participants. So the blue bar represents the percentage of participants that thought that the general population was affected by each of these negative effects. And the red bar represents the percentage of participants who thought that they themselves were affected by these general effects. So there's two main things to notice about the graph. The first is the difference between the blue and the red bars. So for each of these different effects, more people thought that the general population were affected than they were affected. So this signifies the presence of the optimism bias. The other thing to notice is the difference between the blue bars and the top of the graph. So only a certain percentage of participants thought that the general population were affected by each of these negative effects. This signifies a lack of awareness that smartphones can have this impact on people. Now, not all of these effects were equal. More people knew about decreased hours of sleep and worsened sleep quality than, say, task proficiency when a smartphone is only present, only sitting on your desk. But either way, participants' awareness was not comprehensive. Now, we compared people's answers with their different demographic groups, or with their different demographics. So we found that age was negatively correlated with the number of reported personal effects. This means as age increased, the number of personal effects that people reported decreased. So this is sort of expected because older people tend not to use smartphones as much and maybe not even own smartphones as much. So they may not experience these negative effects as much, which would result in this result. Now, age was not correlated with the number of perceived general effects. So that means across all age groups, people were more or less in agreement about what did and did not affect the general population. Now, as for the reported personal effects and general effects, we did not find any correlation with gender or race. And the same goes for optimism bias. We did not see that it varied between men and women or minorities and non-minorities. Now, there are some important limitations to consider when we interpret the results of this study. The first is that we had a non-representative sample. So the sample size was 221. That was a small portion of Middlesex. females and females and Caucasians were quite overrepresented. Now, this means that we cannot generalize our results to the middle sex population. We cannot say that they would hold true if we got responses from all of the student body. It doesn't really invalidate the results that we have, however. So the second limitation is that participants may have answered dishonestly. Seeing as it's an anonymous survey, this is certainly a possibility. However, since there were no incentives offered and people completed the survey of their own free will, it's fairly unlikely that a significant portion of them answered dishonestly. Now, the last important and most important limitation is that in this study, the optimism bias was measured inaccurately. As we said before, the optimism bias is the tendency of one to rate their personal risk of experiencing a negative event or a negative effect as lower than the risk of the general population. Now, in our survey, we did not ask people to rate their personal risk compared to the general population's risk. We asked them to, whether or not they thought they were affected by each of these negative effects at that given moment, whether, like, no matter how much they use their smartphones each day. So this essentially means that we cannot say from the data in our study whether or not optimism bias was present in our population. Now, to sum it up, what we can say is that awareness was not comprehensive in the population that we studied. So what this may mean is that healthcare specialists might need to educate the public on the potential negative effects of smartphone use. Now, whether the lack of awareness of the public is consequential enough to warrant this intervention, we cannot really say from our study, and that needs to be determined from future research. As for the prevalence of the optimism bias, our research did not really determine whether definitively it was present, but it is still an important factor. It could influence the implementation of any public education programs if they were to be conducted. So as with the lack of awareness, the optimism bias should also be studied in future research. With that, I will conclude this presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And are there any questions?
So normally we would all applaud. So since everyone else is muted, I'm going to applaud on behalf of everybody else.
Well,
Oh, and so is Dr. Mink. Okay, is that an applause or is that a hand for a question, Steve?
No, that is sign language for applause.
Great. Okay, cool. All right. So, are there any questions for Tavish and/or Adam? No one? Okay. You guys did an awesome job, especially managing that last limitation, which I know was a little hairy. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I think we will move on. So thank you, Adam and Tavish.
thank you.
Okay, so you guys can mute yourselves. And our next group, our next presenters are Christopher Guzman, Jacob Murphy, and Elizabeth McLean. They are presenting their project entitled Perceptions of the Mass Consciousness of MXCC Students and its Effect on Academic Performance. So let me unmute these guys. I don't know why that's not working. Chris, do you want to try to unmute yourself? It's not letting me.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yep, thank you. I don't know, and Jacob, I'm having the same problem.
There's a permission prompt that comes up on the screen that the participants will have to answer.
Yeah, so that's for the video, but I should be able to get the audio. Okay, and then Libby. And Libby, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Okay, fabulous. You guys are good to go whenever you're ready. Whoever, I don't know who's first, if you want to share your screen.
All right, I will take it away.
Thanks, Jacob.
All right, can everybody see this? Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and my fellow students here. My name is Jacob Murphy. I am actually a former student of Middlesex Community College, which feels a little weird to say now. I graduated in the fall of 2019 from the honors program with a degree in engineering science. Joining me today are Libby McLean and Christopher Guzman. They are current students and current members of the honors program and are studying ecology and biology, respectively. Now, as part of our honors psychology course that we took in the fall of 2019, Dr. Levy gave us the opportunity to participate and create a independent research project, which involved a survey distributed to the MXCC student body and culminated in a final research paper and now a Convivium presentation. Our topic of choice was on the perceptions of mass consciousness of MXCC students and its effect on academic performance, and we will get into exactly what that means here in just one moment. So diving right in, I don't think I need to tell anybody here that college is a particularly stressful experience. I, least of all, don't need to tell you that during these strange times we find ourselves in. And that dropping out has severe consequences for students. According to the preliminary research that we did, 38.8% of all students fail to attain degrees within 6 years of beginning their academic careers, with about a third of students dropping out entirely. These numbers are for the United States and are some of the highest in the world. Students who drop out of college average only $809 a week while working full-time, whereas students who complete a 4-year degree tend to make an average of about $1,200 per week, and this is extrapolated over a period of time. So we wanted to look at what is exactly causing this. More specifically, we wanted to see if there was a link between academic performance, dropout rates, and social belonging. According to the research we did, our theory should be correct. Academic performance, at least as it relates to academic performance, increasing with social belonging. But the studies that we found related only to the 4-year environment and not the 2-year community college system. And I think you'll agree that each campus and community kind of has their own culture. So we wanted to apply this theory to the Middlesex community and see what we found. Our hypothesis in particular was this: a perceived sense of belonging, defined as the perception to which individuals think they fit into a group, is positively correlated with increased academic performance and satisfaction with their MXCC experience. And there's one part of that that I really want you to hone in on, and that is the term perception. And you will see why that is critical later on in the presentation. And with that, I am going to now pass it on to Libby, and she is going to take you through our methods and procedures.
Okay. So the participants of our survey were current Middlesex Community College students taking at least one on-ground class at the Middletown campus in the fall semester of 2019. Exclusions were online-only students and students only taking classes at the Platt campus. These people were excluded because they would not have an accurate view of the main MXCC campus consensus. Our survey was approved by the Middlesex Community College Institutional Review Board, and participants were recruited via an email sent to their student email addresses. And the survey was completed online, anonymously, with no incentives between October 25th and November 1st, 2019. The survey consisted of multiple sections, including a demographic and academic section, which asked for age, gender identity, transfer status, hours on campus, and other things. The main body of the survey was a yes or no that this is true for the majority of MXCC students regarding certain interests, and the same topics, yes or no that that is true for me We also asked, how well do you feel you fit in at MXCC, how satisfied you are with MXCC, and if they were currently or ever in the past considering dropping out of college. They were also asked to provide their GPA by finding it themselves on the Banner website. So these are some of the specific questions that we asked. Is this true for the majority of MXCC students, or is it true for me? Whether they identified conservatively, politically, whether they supported hate speech regulations or stricter immigration laws, among others. And here are some more of the questions, whether they personally identified as religious or spiritual, whether they practice or are interested in alternative medicine, and whether they use social media extensively. So to analyze our data, we took all of the viewpoints that had more than a 50% one way or the other response for what they believed the majority viewpoint was, and that was the perceived consensus. And the same was done for what they themselves believed, and that was the true consensus. Then we created a new variable for whether they believed, the participants believed they were part of the consensus and were incorrect, whether they believed they were part of the consensus and were correct, whether they believed they were not part of the consensus and were incorrect, whether they believed they were not part of the consensus and were correct. A variable was then created to indicate the extent to which each subject correctly perceived themselves as part of the consensus, and these were associated with GPA, consideration of dropping out, and if they felt they fit at MXCC. And now I'm going to pass it over to Chris.
Thank you, Libby. So we had excluded 15 total students, and 3 of which were due to nonsensical answers, and 12 due to their lack of attendance on the main MXCC campus. So out of 76 students that we looked at, 64.5% were female, and 30.3 were transfer students. And these students spent about 11.8 hours on campus per week and had an average of 3.3, which would be a B average, B plus. So what does this mean? Well, we found that there was a strong consensus had emerged across the topics that we examined, and a large percentage of the students had common consensus on topics like abortion, privacy rights, environmental regulations. Yet neither of the variables that we looked at correlated strongly to higher GPA or consideration of dropping out. And the extent to which the subjects correctly or incorrectly believed themselves to be part of the consensus equated to higher GPA. And students who felt they fit in at the MXCC, reported higher satisfaction. So our results supported our hypothesis, like Jacob had mentioned. Whether the subjects were truly in agreement with the campus consensus was largely irrelevant, and that was associated with the academic performance. And results we found that our results had perfectly complemented previous research on the matter in terms of our survey, and that was those studies were done at 4-year institutions. No correlation between the sense of belonging and dropping out rates were found. So some of the limitations that we saw were that the sample collected may not have represented the the population of the college students, and that was based on the data that we collected on the survey. So we only had 91 students who took the survey. However, the majority of the views reported are consistent with those seen in other college samples. The second limitation that we found was that the sample size, a sample might not have been representative of all MXC students, and again, that falls under the survey. And we saw that students who check their emails regularly are therefore taking the survey, may be higher in conscientiousness, therefore have higher GPAs. And students who participated in extracurricular activities, such as taking the survey, might be heavily involved on campus, so they believe themselves to be members of the campus consensus. And respondents and the third limitation was that respondents might have been dishonest, might have provided dishonest answers in terms of viewpoints or GPA due to ostracizing based on personal views, meaning that they might have felt that they would feel uncomfortable if their views were somehow portrayed somewhere. So in conclusion, the results of the studies were found to support our hypothesis that students who generally identify with campus cultures tend to have higher GPAs. And these results complemented previous research on the matter. Like I mentioned, a lot of the studies that we saw were from four-year institution, but we were interested in seeing this at a two-year institution. And interestingly, it seems that whether the subjects were indeed in agreement with the campus consensus was mostly irrelevant. And the only relevant factor was that they themselves believed they were members of the consensus. And some of the implications that we saw with our research was that if institutions were to invest into forming campus cultures, that would greatly benefit their students. And another was that an active campus environment encourages students to invest more time in extracurriculars, and like seen with our results, tend to also get or have higher academic performance. And some of the other things that we saw in terms of our research could be applied to, maybe the research that we found could be applied to examining how unified cultures might affect both the greater student population and workplace environments. And also it could be translated to our current state where we are learning online. And that is it. Thank you for tuning in, and any questions?
Beautiful job. Oh, we have a question. Let's see. So is that Rebecca Lowe? Rebecca, oh, there you go. Rebecca, do you want to ask your question?
I can't get on.
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I'm having a little trouble with my computer, so I actually can't see the question that I wrote, but so I think this is it. I think so. I'm really interested in this concept that you look at, the sense of belonging. And when I think of that, I think, sort of the shadow side or the opposite is loneliness. And so I'm wondering if you think of, as I think of sense of belonging, sort of that the contrast with that would be loneliness. And so that's my first question. How do you see loneliness sort of fitting in with people who don't feel a sense of belonging?
Well, in terms of our results, we weren't really focusing on that particular aspect. But if we were to look at the sense of loneliness, I would extrapolate that maybe you would see kind of some matching up in terms of the results that we got, where students who weren't part of the sense of belonging tend to weren't benefiting from the interactions that could potentially benefit them academically and socially. Does that answer your question?
Yes, exactly. And it was some of your discussion of your findings that made me think of loneliness. That concept as maybe being helpful for you, because some ways of interpreting your findings connected to the sense of maybe not being engaged with others, rather than just feeling that you shared a campus culture or a sense of shared beliefs. So I think you guys did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I actually might add something to Chris's answer, I agree with what he said. And while our individual study did not necessarily look at the inverse of that, if you're asking for maybe a personal take on how loneliness might affect academic performance, I think something interesting to look at would be the fact that, again, it was the perceived sense of belonging that individuals felt that was more important than whether they actually belong,
yes,
or quote unquote actually belong to the consensus in terms of viewpoints and such. And
Yeah.
so it might be true that you could look at simply convincing people and giving them that sense that they belong on campus, regardless of maybe what their specific viewpoints are or what have you, just creating a welcoming environment where everybody can feel that they belong and that they have a place on campus. I would not be surprised to see that directly correlate to increased performance.
Thank you. I appreciate that consideration, and I would support your thinking as well.
Awesome. Oh, Adrian has joined us. Hey, Adrian.
I've been on for a while. How are you?
Hey, Dean Maslin.
Hi, Jacob. Congratulations to you.
Thank you.
So, and Chris and Libby, we don't know each other. I used to teach in the honors program. So congratulations to all three of you. I thought it was a fabulous presentation. My question deals with the complexity of the questions on your survey. And, you know, as I was looking at those questions when you had them posted, a number of them struck me, but the one I'm thinking of and that hit me most was the one dealing with hate speech. And I think a lot of these questions really require some deep thought. When I think about hate speech compared with my beliefs in freedom of speech in general, you know, I kind of weigh those. And I think many of those questions are like that. And I'm just wondering, you know, if you feel that people really honestly answered those questions. I know you mentioned that some people may not have been quite so honest because they felt that, you know, they wanted to be part of the consensus and maybe didn't think that their own true beliefs were part of it. But I'm really talking about people who kind of had to labor over their response to certain questions, and whether you think that affected the survey results at all.
I think they definitely did. And in fact, I can give you the numbers for that question in particular. I have them pulled up right here. The support for hate speech regulations in terms of this is true for me, so what people themselves actually thought, we received 52 yes responses and 25 no responses. And the question was, again, do you support hate speech regulations? And that's a very complex question. That was one of the concerns that I had when conducting this survey is, are people actually going to consider the full implications of their answers here? And I think that more comes down to people being educated on the particular topics. That was one of the reasons why we had so many questions, is that we kind of wanted to hopefully eliminate the factor of individuals being less interested or less educated about a particular topic just through volume. But I do believe that that may have been a concern and an issue in a number of the responses of people not necessarily considering a lot of the answers that they gave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and adding to what Jacob had said, I think that like you had mentioned, these questions were really complex, and there was no way we could really capture, all the, the entirety of what we were trying to look for in the study. But what it allowed us to do is take kind of like a screenshot of kind of the overall general thought, and base our our kind of our results and some of our thought with that snapshot. And keep in mind, we did kind of conducted this study in a semester, but if we had more time, our results would have been, I believe, would have been more complex, like the questions, and we would have seen some more interesting things there too.
Do you guys remember if SurveyMonkey recorded how long each participant took taking the survey? It's obviously not a perfect measure because, right, someone could start the survey and then walk away, but at least it could give you a sense of, is there anyone who's spending so little time here that, I feel like we did look at that, so little time here that we can't trust their answers. Kind of as Adrian said, a lot of this does require a good deal of thought. Anyways, something you can look at.
Yes,
later.
yeah. As far as I know, no, there was no recording of how long individual responses took.
All right, I think we have another question from Ben. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I just didn't know if I was unmuted or not. I had written into the chat board, did you think about asking questions about mental health history or perceived social status? I know that they were anonymous, and I know that those questions can definitely affect people's happiness. So I figured, I don't know if those were things that were considered ahead of time or if you left them out for specific reasons. I was just curious as to why.
I believe we did think about having certain questions like that, but we chose to leave them out because we figured it might be a little too personal.
That's understandable. I was just curious as to the reasoning.
It also might have expanded our study kind of past the scope that we were prepared to address, and would have maybe, it's the same reason why we left online students out. Like, that would have been really interesting to look at how online students feel about these issues. But it would have created a whole nother layer of complexity and analysis that we would have needed to do. And again, we were fairly time limited here. But that would be something very interesting to look at, is to see how mental health history and social status has an effect on these numbers.
I think you did a great job. I'm not putting you down at all or anything like that. I just was just curious to the notions of those two concepts.
Mm-hmm.
That's it for me. I'm all set. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Do we have any others?
You're muted, Andy.
Oh.
Sorry.
I was wondering what was going on there.
Rachel, is it Rachel with her hand up?
Yes, I'm sorry. I noticed I was unmuted, but I didn't know if that was intentional or not. Sorry about that. My question was, after receiving your data and analyzing it, have you thought of any, or each individual one of you, have you thought of any applications or things that you can specifically do at MXCC or you would recommend? And also, I think Jacob touched on the idea of perceived acceptance and perceived versus perceived loneliness in the community here at a college, for whether or not they're what data lied with them. what would you address then if somebody was of an older age, or they were specifically, you know, at MXTC, where it's a commuter college, and they had so much available time to be here? What would you approach that with?
Well, I personally think that MXCC has a really great environment. It's very inclusive, and I think that a lot of the events that happen at MXCC also are inducive to inviting everybody, from depending, you know, race, age. It really doesn't matter, but these events really help. But to answer your question, I think that in terms for like MXCC, in order to kind of improve maybe some to get more, I guess, more attendance or more activities, that has to fall under the types of events, like I mentioned. Obviously, certain events, you know, might be more directed towards, let's say, younger people. If it's something to do with, you know, social media or something that's really current. I mean, not that, you know, older audiences have, you know, are not interested in it, but usually younger audiences tend to kind of head towards that. But I would say, in terms of maybe the events that we have at MXCC, that would be an area to look into in order to improve, if there's anything to improve upon. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I really loved to hear your thoughts on that, because I think while your study was short-lived, you got very in-depth about what kinds of questions you could look at. As you said, you had also thought about the mental health questions, which is another layer into it, as you mentioned. And I think the thought put into it is very, very relevant, very prevalent in how you guys have presented. So
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Let's see. Bolt?
Hi. Hey, great job, guys. I really enjoyed hearing about the study. You put a lot of thought into it. I thought that was great. I think you're probably right on the money with your analysis that there's a self-selection bias, that there's a correlation between the type of student that would check their email and take the time to answer the survey questions and someone who is also motivated to perform well in classes. So my question is, if you were to expand the study, how would you eliminate that skewing of the results? And then how, I guess I hear a lot of people suggesting how to reach out to students that don't feel included, but if you're not reaching the students that don't feel included through the email survey, then I think that would be important to figure out how to reach them, so that then you could, excuse me, tailor events to that type of person.
To answer the first part of your question, I think that the only real way to help eliminate that limitation is simply through trying to reach out to students in a diverse way as possible. Of course, you know, at a certain point, the student does have to take action, which is what we encourage people to do at things like, you know, any honors events that we have, or when we do new student orientation. We really push the idea of, you know, get involved on campus, reach out to people, participate in events. We really, really push that idea and encourage people to do that because of that very bias that we ran into of, you know, the people who are more conscientious and the people who are put more time in, of course, are going to do better in school because they're the people who are more conscientious and put more time in. But yeah, in terms of how to address it, I think the only real way to do it is to just try to reach out to people in as many ways as possible, in as many ways as they might be receptive to. In my mind, I can't really think of any other way to combat that.
The adding to what Jacob had said, I think that if we were to kind of implement kind of like a priming system where you would capture the snapshot of or try to figure out who are the or what kind of students or who are the students who are not being I guess or not or feeling welcome or having that sense of belonging. I think that once we figure out what that is and who those people are, and then implementing some certain programs that will add them to that mass consciousness per se, would probably eliminate that. But it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because you also introduce another limitation, being that you might have changed the type you might have changed the outcomes of some of those results that you were getting. So it's kind of hard to especially for that limitation. I would say it's kind of hard to gauge and how to really approach it. From what I can think of, there's no really clear-cut way in order to go about that. But really good question.
All right, thank you so much, guys. Very nice job. So if you want to go ahead and mute yourselves, our next presenters are Eva Barber, Silvana Berno, and Alyssa Pardo. And their presentation is entitled Student-Teacher Perceptions and the Willingness of Students to Seek Academic Help. So let me make sure you guys are unmuted. There's Eva, Silvana, and Alyssa. I have to get your video going. Okay, that should be all of you. Yep. Oh, wait. You guys good?
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello. Okay. And can everyone see my screen? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Alyssa, as it was said, and I'm joined with Eva and Silvana. And we decided to do our project on the student-teacher perceptions and the willingness of students to seek academic help, or the student relationships and their willingness to seek help outside of the classroom. So we all know that college degrees are a lot of time and they're a lot of energy and money. The average annual cost of a four-year institution is around $20,000 to $40,000. And we found that those who receive a college degree earn more money than those who only receive their high school GED. Students who graduate with the degree also tend to have jobs that fulfill their sense of accomplishment and offer more independence and creativity. However, the dropout rate of college students in four-year schools is around 30 to 50%. So knowing this, it's important to examine the ways in which we can improve the retention in college institutions. And we thought that one such way would examine the ways to improve a student's willingness to seek help from professors outside of the classroom, because student-faculty interactions increase student retention, they increase satisfaction, cognitive development, and performance in the classes. And we came across one study that found that 60% of the participants didn't use office hours. Excuse me, 66%. And specifically, this research has not yet addressed the factors that affect student willingness in a community college setting, which is more relevant to what we are doing right now since we're a part of MXCC. We also found that 81% of entering college students indicate that they want, community college students indicate that they want to earn at least a bachelor's degree, but only 33% end up transferring to the four-year institution. Now, this brings us right here. So we wanted to learn, how do a student's perceptions of their professors affect their willingness for academic reasons? We wanted to answer the ongoing discussion of why students fail to seek academic assistance, even though we know it's a vital resource for their education, and to try to prevent any subsequent rise in dropout rates, increase their retention, and foster a positive learning environment. So we ended up designing our survey to determine our students' perceptions of their teachers and comparing that with their willingness to seek assistance outside of class. And then we sent it to our own community college to receive the data that we lacked. And now I'll send it on to Silvana so she can talk about our methods.
Okay. Alrighty. So the population for the study included current students enrolled at Middlesex Community College in the fall of 2019, excluding those who are taking solely online courses. They had to take at least one on-ground course to participate. We only used on-ground course students because they have greater contact with their teacher, and there is more of a relationship that is formed than if the student were taking an online course. The survey asked about, the student demographics and the perceived traits of the first teacher that they had every week. This was then compared to the student's willingness to seek help from that professor. Demographic questions ask things like the student's race, gender, and age, as well as how many classes they have taken and the current grade in that course. When the students were asked about their teachers, the possible traits that the teachers may or may not have had included, but was not limited to, is that teacher a parent? Are they open to questions? Do they have a good sense of humor? Do they favor students? Are they kind? As well as others, which will be elaborated on later. The students were finally asked to rate their likeliness to seek help from this professor as on a scale of 1 to 10 to be compared with the answers given to the questions above. Of the people that responded to the survey, 69.6% were white, 14% were Latino, 5.3% identified as African American, 0.9% were Asian, and 10.5% answered other. 67.5% answered that they were female, 29.8% were male, and 2.6% answered other. This matches MXCC's student population, as the majority of students are female. In terms of grades, 58.8% told us that they were getting an A in the class they had with a specific teacher. 27.2% had a B, 11.4% had a C, 1.8% a D, and 0.9% answered other or an F. And now I will be handing the microphone to Eva LaRue. Hello?
So I'm going to be talking about the results section of this. Let me just pull my screen up really quick. Can you guys see it? Cool. So these are our unrelated results to the correlation on our scale from 1 to 10. This is the percentage that answered yes to whether their teacher had the trait or not, just based on Middlesex Community College. So we can see that the majority of participants in our survey endorsed positive attributes to their teacher, represented at the top in this majority section, such as, does this professor seem open to questions? If a student doesn't understand the topic, do they try and explain it? Are they a fail grader? Do they seem kind, etc.? And the negative attributes were rated a lot lower throughout our survey, which is very positive for representing Middlesex educators. Some interesting statistics that we found in our study, however, were about half of the students believed the professor wanted them to come for academic help outside of the class, and less than half, at 43.9%, believe that other students were seeking out academic help. So this is the main importance of our studies. Not a lot of people are taking advantage of this assistance for their academic success. So these are our results related on our scale from 1 to 10. These are the traits that had a negative or no impact versus the traits that had a positive impact on the student's willingness to seek academic help. So students who felt their professor were kind, enthusiastic, open to questions, and cared about the student's success and general well-being were significantly more likely to seek academic help outside of the class, shown on this graph. We also found the likeliness of students seeking academic aid increased when the student felt their professor had a good sense of humor, explained information clearly, freely, was a fair grader, had office hours, and seemed like they wanted the student to come. Students who believed their professors favored certain students, however, and made students who asked questions feel stupid were very much less likely to seek academic help outside. Our study did have some limitations, however. One limitation that might have affected were the results respondents' bias towards their professors. For example, those who liked their professors a lot or those who didn't were more likely to respond to this survey. Another limitation that we had was the email was sent out on a Friday. So the only potential subjects receiving the opportunity to complete the survey would be the ones who checked their school email, checked it over the weekend, or it wasn't buried by Monday. The sample size itself was also a small fraction of the Middlesex community population. We only had 114 responses, and the population of this school is much larger than that. So it was a limitation of what the group was. So what we can conclude from this survey is that generally more positive behaviors and actions will increase a student's likeliness to seek academic help, while the negative behaviors will decrease that likelihood. This result is consistent with other studies that we have seen. For example, a professor's sense of humor, which is shown in both our study and others, has a strong impact on a student's willingness to seek help and interact with faculty. The professors appearing as if they want the students to seek help as well is also very impactful. The study was also able to prove its own importance, which is very interesting because we found the results that had a direct correlation between students with higher grades and students who were seeking help, proving that cognitive development is increased when students seek academic help outside of the classroom. Still, students have not been utilizing this strategy to its full potential, despite the fact that we proved it will help your education. The results of our study helped to further identify positive and negative attributes that professors can have that will increase the students seeking help, specifically in a community college setting. So our questions were, how do a student's perceptions of professors affect their willingness to seek help for academic reasons? And what can professors do to increase the likeliness of their students seeking help? We encourage further research to be done to determine the steps specifically that educators can do to increase this willingness to seek help. And though we did not find a correlation in our study, we would encourage further research to be done on the impact of demographics such as gender and race in relationship to the students seeking help. Breaking down the barriers between students and their professors and having a safe, healthy, and comfortable learning environment helps students prosper academically and prevents them from feeling like they cannot utilize the resources provided to them. Thank you so much for your time.
Beautiful job. I do want to clarify for anyone who might be wondering that the professors who were being discussed, reported about, were never named in any way, shape, or form. So
Yes.
the students were asked to identify the first on-ground course that they have in a week, in a normal week schedule, and to then respond to the questions about that professor, but that professor was never named, nor were the students named. So all completely anonymous. Okay, with that said, are there any questions for Eva, Silvana, and Alyssa? No, no one? Okay. All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have John Gulliman, whose presentation is entitled Ressentiment is Our Liveliest Sentiment. So let me get you up here, John.
Yeah, hello? Let's see.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, let me share my screen. Application. All right, are we good here?
You're good.
All right, excellent. So, hello everyone. My name is John Gilliman. I'm an electrical engineering major, but my interest lies in history, the arts, and to some extent politics. So the title is Ressentiment is Our Liveliest Sentiment, and this is a play on the quote, pain is our liveliest sentiment, which really encapsulates the Enlightenment project, which my mentor, Michael Roth of Wesleyan, defines as the project to make the world more of a home for human beings through reason. And that's associated with all sorts of universal human rights, improving our health conditions and so forth. But some thinkers at the time speculated that the way we were going about it would lead to greater inequalities, which could lead to outbursts of violence that we've seen throughout the 20th century and so forth. So that topic became very broad. That was sort of the beginning of my project. So I had to simplify it.
John, I'm
Hello?
so sorry to interrupt. We can only see half of your screen. Do you want to try unsharing it and then resharing it?
I don't know what's happening. Is it working?
It's for some reason it's like black on one side and your screen on the other. That's so weird.
So what do you see?
Full screen?
Absolutely not, no.
Yeah, we see that's so weird. We see the left side of your slides and the right side is completely black. Okay, it is what it is. Proceed.
I'm sorry. So should I leave it? Is this okay?
You put it in landscape.
Where was I?
John, do you want to try putting it in landscape?
Landscape. Where is that? Design. Sorry. View. I'm not familiar with this. I apologize.
It's all right. We'll manage. Sorry to interrupt.
It's okay. So yeah, so I had to reduce the scope of my project because that was a huge historical undertaking to trace all sorts of contemporary extremist movements to unresolved conflicts dating back to the Enlightenment. So instead, I tried to use some of the findings I found, particularly the concept of ressentiment, to explain a current political phenomenon, which is the rise of right-wing populist movements, which is generally, due to its unpredictable natures, a lot of our experts got it wrong, has been an unresolved task of the social sciences. So I am taking that on. So what is right-wing populism and how could we distinguish it from other political movements? Well, the Cass Mood from the University of Georgia recognizes three key features. Nativism is not quite nationalism. It's that the native people should control the state. and that non-native entities can be considered a threat, or that could be people, ideas, religion, and so forth. Often it took the place of anti-Islamic rhetoric. A lot of these movements partook in that. Authoritarianism, while a lot of these movements occur within democracies, the leaders elected are often considered authoritarian strongmen. They held democratic norms in contempt, and there's a huge focus on crime and law and order. And then populism, which is also shared with left-wing variants of populism, and that's simply that there's a dichotomy between the common people and the elite, and they define the elite differently. The two different political persuasions. The elite for left wing is populists are usually banks and their allies, billionaires, and so forth. People using power to obtain more power. Whereas right wing populists tend to define the elite as academics, feminists, or even billionaires such as George Soros, but they're using their power to sort of change values or push a certain agenda. And as you'd see, there's no particular financial policy associated with it, because they could support, for example, we don't associate welfare states with right-wing politics, but it's still tied to these elements. For the example, in Poland, they have a welfare state, but it's tied to nativism. It's for the native people. We shouldn't be spending money on migrants or refugees and so forth. So we see a huge rise of these movements in the 21st century, particularly in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, who's said to use this sort of rhetoric in his campaign in particular, and then the UK referendum to leave the EU in 2016. And so this becomes an important task. And one of the influential approaches is to tie it to changes and socioeconomic conditions. And these are tied to all sorts of isizations. We're talking globalization, privatization, destabilization of certain countries, and this could lead to different forms of changes in our work life. And these are all the recorded examples of how that might play out, that we're working longer hours, increased workload for lesser and lesser money. And the main takeaway here is that it leads to a state of inequality, rising and rising inequality since around 1972 or so, where the balance of wealth and power is being shifted to a lesser and lesser amount of people. And there's just greater forms of competition due to all these forms of migration, where we have to compete with each other for all sorts of social and economic recognition. And this could lead to decreasing social solidarities and so forth. And this is a very influential theory, and it generally holds, especially the losers of globalization have great support for these movements. We're talking the sort of coal regions, the Rust Belt in the United States, parts of Europe that are affected by outsourcing and so forth. You'll see a large percentage of support for these movements, but you can't win national elections on that. So there has to be something more at stake. So there's some blind spots to this approach, in that there's support for these parties in countries that have extensive welfare systems, such as the Scandinavian countries. They're not winning, the grand elections there, but there's still support for these movements there. And in areas like Germany, where there's low unemployment. And also we see a lot of support in places such as the east part of Germany, where they voted in heavy numbers for the Alternative for Deutschland, a very anti-refugee group, and eastern parts of the country where there's almost no interaction of immigration whatsoever. And also the people who are profiting from globalization also support these movements. So another approach from philosophers and critical theorists and so forth is to use the concept of ressentiment. So essentially the way I defined it, sourcing from one of the chief developers of ressentiment, Friedrich Nietzsche, and elaborated by Max Scheler, is that ressentiment is an affect, which is a feeling or a mood, an expression born out of a sense of weakness or inferiority. It expresses itself as a hostile attitude towards those believed to be responsible for their suffering. It disparages the lifestyle of others and devalues their beliefs. So essentially, it's very similar. People can use the word resentment quite interchangeably. However, it implies more of an internal mechanism. So the way that plays out in the Nietzschean approach is that it's quite sort of slave morality, that the weak see the strong. And this is not the one I'm following. I'm more of a Scheller. I'm usually go from Scheller, but this is the easiest way to explain it. So the weak see the strong, the beautiful, and so forth. And it starts with a social comparison, a sense of entitlement, where why are they so beautiful? Why are they so strong? It makes me feel bad that I'm not like that. And then it leads to the transvaluation of all values, which is a very essentially sour grapes where, you know, they're not so great anyway. They're evil for making me feel this way. We can redirect all sorts of, and this leads to scapegoating where this sort of feeling, this sort of pain gets redirected, and it can get redirected towards the original cause, or it can get redirected anywhere. As Nietzsche says, like, someone has to feel my misery, whoever it is, and it could be redirected towards things. But the big takeaway for me is from Scheller, who says that these sort of mob mentality, these sort of expressions of anger in political form happen most when there's, due to social structure, where there's a discrepancy between formal equality and these sort of values that we have, and the very real forms of grand inequalities. And that's what, so he posited that in around World War I. And we might say, due to our socioeconomic conditions today, we are in such a condition, particularly after the 2008 financial crashes. So I seek to combine Scheller's philosophical concept of ressentiment with some of the work of political psychologists. So they generally posit all sorts of thinking models for the different political persuasions, like a different set of thinking for right-wing individuals and left-wing individuals. So Schaume and Schieve in particular, two political psychologists out of Germany, propose a model to explain both right-wing and left-wing populism, and that due to all the different types of attitudinal research, the political psychology research that proposes different models, that right-wing and left-wing adherents responds to the socioeconomic conditions in different ways. So right-wing supporters will blame themselves during these times of economic uncertainty, the precarious life situation that we find ourselves in, whereas left-wing's supporters will externalize their sort of feelings about it, and that might lead to mass movements and so forth, like Occupy Wall Street, for example. And this sort of model tries to explain how it could be felt by not only those who are at the very bottom, because this sort of situation puts us that even if we have jobs, we're always on like the chopping block in a way. We're always sort of have to work harder or take more jobs and so forth, this sort of precarious situation. So it could be insecurity about an upcoming loss rather than suffering from a current one. And that's not a Karl Marx quote, that's from Paul Marx, who particularly tried to test this hypothesis by exposing a large range, I think 4,000 people, to populist rhetoric while asking them to questions about their own financial situation, their own social situation. And generally they responded very angrily regardless of their status. And the anger is what we can sort of measure. We can see these forms of anger, but we can't, the internalized shame bit that's part of ressentiment, we can't really measure. So that's the limitation of this approach. But taken together, I believe it gives a fuller picture of how these socioeconomic conditions can express themselves in these particular political movements that are driven by a sense of anger and so forth. So the big thing I want you guys to take away here is to sort of reflect on how some people might say we might want to revolutionize our system to sort of remove these social economic differences. That itself might lead to other imbalances and other problems. And I'm certainly not someone in position to recommend how one might go about that, or how we as a society might go about that. But we can at least come away with an awareness of how the structure of our society can affect our lives in ways. For example, we hosted a PTK event where we talked about stress in school, and we sort of did it from a sense of reliant ethos that it's like on us that we have like to come up with strategies to cope with it. But now I might say we should have an awareness of how the way our structured society towards greater competition and so forth can negatively impact our lives and lead to more stress. And this was just one example of it, how it might lead to these particular political movements. So if you guys have any questions, I'll take them. And here's some works cited.
Thank
Hello,
you.
am I still here?
You're here. You want to restart your video so we can see you? Or do you want me
I
to-
didn't know it stopped.
Yeah. On my end, it says that we can see you, but we can't.
Yeah, it's frozen. This is bad.
That's all right. We can still hear you. It's so far fabulous. Does anybody have a question for John? Oh, Melissa. Okay. Go for it, Melissa.
Oh yeah, that's actually, yeah, Melissa's question. Oh, I read it. She's gonna say it. Okay.
Yeah, this is fascinating, and maybe this is more of an economic question than what you're focused on. But do you think that there's any correlation between the shift in the balance of wealth that you mentioned beginning in 1972 with the recession in the early 1970s that ended much of the post-World War II economic expansion?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call that period, that's like the beginning of the Great Regression, post 1970s and so forth, where we shift away from, what is it, Keynesian economics towards more towards deregulation and so forth. And yeah, that erased a lot of what was considered the golden age of capitalism of, I'm not sure of the time period, but associated with the 50s and 60s. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely believe that's the case. There's absolutely a correlation between that, and there's no other way to put it. Because we also talked about, yeah, this is the Great Regression. That was also like an alternative way, but I couldn't really get too much into that material. And then it gets led to, you know, Thatcher politics and Reagan. And then the third way, more of a centrist, but still tied to economic deregulation in the 90s, associated with Bill Clinton and so forth. And then we get to the 2008 recession. I definitely believe there's a big correlation between, that's the socioeconomic conditions I was sort of trying to get by. I tried to speed it up a little bit, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's going to make a great thesis topic at some point.
Yeah.
For you.
Certainly.
Really well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Eva Jones has a question for you.
Hi, John. Well done. Really great work. So I'm actually interested in how your work might shine some light on the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that the pandemic will challenge or support some of these right-wing populist movements?
It's a good question. So I talked about this with Michael Ruff a little bit at Wesleyan. And we said that like maybe the positive hope that like some of the scapegoating might be directed towards the virus itself. That might alleviate some of it. But unfortunately, what I've been seeing is that a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of, I think one of the popular ones was that there were some right-wing populist groups, or these sort of, it was like an NRA group, and they hosted a bunch of fake, they made a bunch of Facebook pages to have these sort of stay-at-home orders, protests and so forth around the country. That's a big topic around the past few couple of days. But the hope would be that, I don't know if there's a hope there, but there might be less support, the issues change, but maybe there might be more support. I'm not quite sure.
I know, it's really crazy. I mean, even with the news yesterday with Donald Trump and like injecting bleach and things so I'm interested. It's really interesting how these social movements either support or vilify like the virus, or certain groups like they pit each other against. Like for instance, I'm seeing more anti like communist arguments kind of
Yeah.
coming out of the woodwork, and yet we have like people saying to drink bleach, or inject bleach or something. It's weird. It's very strange.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also components of that where we have, they're trying to call it like associated with China, which is
Yes.
problematic in itself. And yeah, that's something I haven't thought fully about. It's certainly interesting to see how it goes, because also I heard that the way it might increase support due to us being in a situation and sort of the populace being in control of coming up with the solution for it. But we'll see for sure come election time.
Yeah, right. Interesting. Nice work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Any other questions for John? Okay, thank you so much, John. All right, next up we have Christopher Perry, who will be presenting Covered in Concrete. So a bit of a shift in topic here. Let's see, unmute you. There you are. All right, Chris, hi.
Hello. Just 1 second to share my screen here. Let me get set up. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see such a large turnout for this year's academic convivium, and I am proud to present my topic, Covered in Concrete. Today, we're going to analyze the world's large-scale use of concrete and how we can minimize the environmental effects that it has. So to begin with some properties of concrete and kind of what it is, it's recognized as the #1 building material chosen by engineers and contractors. It has an ability to harden into solids in any form, and it has great resistance to impact and abrasion, giving it strength. The concrete also has an ability to be placed in any environmental condition. This gives peace of mind to builders that their structure will be permanent and go unmoved. Some applications that we can see currently of concrete. These are very elementary examples that hopefully you recognize some in your neighborhood, but the scale that these projects are on is much larger. Projects like this can be seen all across the globe, benefiting society through the creation of infrastructure. The growth at which we continue to create these concrete projects is exponential, especially as our society contributes to rapid urbanization of developing countries. Currently, 10 billion tons of concrete are produced. It is also stated that an additional 5 billion tons of concrete are projected to be increased every year. Concrete's large-scale use gives an ominous effect that the earth is becoming covered in concrete. To establish slightly more background, we can look at concrete's recipe. It's a simple 3-ingredient mix of aggregate, cement, and water. The aggregate is a form of gravel or sand, which provides fill in the mix. The cement does the bonding through a chemical process called hydration, and the water fuels this chemical process. Different ratios of these ingredients can add versatility to concrete. No job kit is too large or too small, as the mix can be designed for any job. This gives the assumption that concrete will be used for any construction project. Now, before we go building everything with concrete, we need to address concrete's red flag. Concrete has a high environmental impact. This environmental impact is largely due to the cement production, which can be summarized through the elementary chemical equation as seen on the screen. We have our inputs, which is naturally found as limestone, and then through large amounts of industrial process of heating and grinding, we produce cement and carbon dioxide. The cement, as noted, is a very important ingredient in the concrete recipe. The carbon dioxide is a byproduct. This byproduct accounts for 8% of global CO2 emissions. This 8% is not for the entire concrete industry, but just the cement production alone. To worsen our scenario, concrete cannot currently be recycled. The way we currently deal with concrete waste is it is broken apart and thrown away. China throws away 5 million tons of concrete into landfills every year. This is an unsustainable practice and causes a rise for environmental concern. To reduce the impact on this, we can look at two scenarios. First, a more traditional approach of substituting cement. The goal here is to lower the amount of cement used, thus lowering the amount of carbon dioxide produced. This can be achieved currently with two substitutions, fly ash and slag. Both of these are byproducts from other industries, fly ash being a byproduct of burning coal to generate electricity. But these can be seen used in a combination of cement, fly ash, and slag currently in large-scale operations. But I have worries that this substitution process is not enough to reduce the CO2 produced because these other industries are harmful as well. A more avant-garde approach to reducing the amount of carbon dioxide emissions is presented by the University of Colorado in Boulder. They're doing research on a material that they present as living concrete. Living concrete is a bacteria which solidifies a gelatin mold to make calcium carbonate, and this provides building blocks to build structures. There are many benefits to this, such as the bacteria grows exponentially on job sites, and its additive features can help create uniform structures. It also does an excellent job in reducing the amount of carbon dioxide produced because as this building material survives, it photosynthesizes and creates oxygen. Options like these are viable into reducing the amount of CO2 emissions, but they are not quite at a large scale use. To conclude on these efforts, current research to recycle concrete is being done. It's not seen at large scales, but the idea of recycling concrete into aggregate is plausible. I offer a practical solution to reducing the amount of concrete of forethought. Projects with concrete should be well planned. Adding features such as ease of maintenance and creating an idea of a long lifespan would provide extra sustainability. Concrete's permanent structure can truly be taken advantage of with using forethought. The economic solution would be adding a correction tax. Adding a tax would increase the price of concrete. This would have a few effects. First, the amount of concrete used would be reduced. Engineers would be forced to be more efficient in their design. The high price of concrete would also stimulate the market for alternatives. This goes back to looking at living concrete. If less people had a demand for concrete, the demand for alternatives increases. Although I cannot answer every question to how to reduce CO2 emissions drastically at this moment, my current goals lead to a future in university research of material engineering. Here, I wish to continue looking for alternative building materials to help reduce this problem and raise awareness of our scenario. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Take any questions now.
Beautiful job, Chris. Questions for Chris?
Hava or not Hava, the student choreography, and that was Ezra, not Chris.
So Adam, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, nice presentation, Chris. I'm wondering if there are any ways that that living concrete is inferior to regular concrete. Why might a company not want to use it?
I didn't know him at that point.
That is a great question, Adam. And it is seen that living concrete does not have comparable strength And the applications for this would have to be shifted. So something like a foundation for a house where it is buried underground, probably the living concrete would not be able to sustain life. But if you were to make the walls of the house out of living concrete, you would still have a very positive structure. And so the applications for these materials are altered because it is not concrete in itself, but it offers similar properties.
All right, thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Adam. Chris, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. So I have a question for you, Chris. So as you were mentioning, it kind of seems that they're starting to I guess our culture is starting to take a turn um, in how we use materials and current day. We're trying to maximize the things that we have, one being concrete. And like you mentioned in your presentation, there's a lot of waste. So what is, I don't know if you encountered any solution to this, but what is preventing a lot of these governments and agencies from taking these ideas and make them into, you know, large scale productions or large scale projects? Like why haven't we seen, you know, these different construction ideas come to reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really goes back to some of the properties that concrete has. Its strength has really been engineered. So it's very controllable and consistent in its use. And it also has a low cost, which drives a lot of people to use it versus trying to invest money into these alternatives, which I mentioned are kind of still at the research phase. There's no large scale implication of it because we haven't agreed upon kind of one material. Everyone is still kind of trying out new ideas. Thank you for your question.
Let's see, we have a question from Ben. Ben, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to know how clean is slag to produce, and I'm pretty sure it gives off a toxic emission, but I don't know that for a fact. And also, I just wanted to say, this was an amazing presentation. I knew next to nothing about concrete or the fact that it even contributed to 8% of the carbon dioxide emissions. That's absolutely amazing knowledge just to have, and thank you for presenting that and putting that forth.
Cool, thank you very much. And to touch on your question, slag is a byproduct of the steel industry. When they melt the steel in crucibles, impurities rise to the top, and that's what the slag is produced. I'm unaware of any environmental concern, any large environmental concern, but there is a large amount of resource input to pulverizing the slag into like a small enough size to be implemented in concrete. So there is a lot of energy input that goes into transforming this byproduct into something usable. So that's why I had kind of leaned away from just substituting cement, is because we don't have too many scenarios where it really drastically reduces the amount of CO2. It might be slight improvements, which are good, and that's why they're currently being implemented. But I'm really trying to look for a way where we can find a better alternative.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, like Ben, I knew absolutely nothing about concrete before working with Chris on this project. And as I said to him along the way, what I found most striking was his ability to teach me about concrete, a topic that honestly I normally would not have any interest in whatsoever, in a way that I actually found engaging and totally understandable. So I give you a lot of credit for that, Chris.
Thank you, that means a lot.
Chris Guzman has a question. Chris, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. So my other question is, I know you mentioned that I don't remember the exact number, but that China goes through several, I guess, thousand pounds of concrete and that they just throw in the landfill. Did you find any other numbers regarding to countries who have um, a, a higher tendency of earthquakes? I know that obviously earthquakes damage infrastructure, especially concrete if it's not poured. But did you find anything to do with the like other countries and how they process um, concrete and how much, like for example, Japan? Did you find anything in terms of that?
I did not find any statistics on other countries. To reiterate the statistic I had mentioned, it was concrete or China introduces 500 million tons of demolition waste, specifically concrete, into landfills every year. I don't believe this takes account into natural disasters. I believe this is just concrete that they have deemed like the use of the project to be over. So instead of creating that project that really lasts for a long time, they kind of created something at their convenience and then were able to destroy it and quote get rid of it. But that getting rid of it, the concrete never left this earth, it just got buried. So they're applying the idea of out of sight, out of mind, which I would assume a lot of other countries are doing, but again, I don't have the statistics to back that up. So I'm really trying to bring this issue to light so people are more aware of it and that these countries kind of cannot get away with just being able to do this.
Great, thank you. I think we have one last question from Melissa. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. I think Dr. Jones actually asked a question earlier about, do you know if any correction tax has been introduced in American government or global ones? And that's kind of my question as well, whether there have been any CO2 emissions taxes on concrete or any kind of other attempts at environmental regulation.
I know currently there are environmental regulations for CO2 production. I don't know, but I can't say from any fact that there's specific implementations for the concrete industry alone. It's just my research was not totally geared to that.
That's totally understandable.
But
It's really interesting. I didn't know anything about this topic before your presentation, so I'm really glad to learn about this.
Thank you. And your question does have a lot of, it is a good question for me kind of looking forward as I go forward into this, as to what current regulations there are. We'll do some more research. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the great questions. Any other questions for Chris? Okay, thank you so much, Chris. Okay, our next speaker is Jack Howell. His presentation is entitled Neurodiversity, A Shifting Understanding of Disability. So let me get you up here, Jack. Where are you? Oh, you're all set. Okay, fabulous.
Okay, great.
You're good with how to share your screen?
Yeah, I thought I had it and I don't see it now.
Do you see the green button at the bottom?
Oh, here it is. All right, can you see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. All right, can everyone hear me?
Actually, your audio is kind of low.
Is there a way to,
Now it's better.
that was better?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Excuse the clock in the background. My name is Jack Howell, and I'm going to talk to you about a concept today called neurodiversity and share some research. When you look at these pictures, when you look at the picture on the left, do you see an old lady or a young woman? When you look at the picture on the right, do you see two faces or a vase? These are optical illusions where it's possible to see both because it's a matter of perspective. I would like to propose today that differences in brains may be similar and that they can be seen as causing disabilities, seen as examples of diversity, or both. It is generally true that having a learning difference makes school and life more difficult. It may be less obvious, but also true that these differences can have strengths. Did you know that as recently as 70 years ago, left-handedness was actually considered a pathological disorder, and it was in the American Psychiatric Manual, and it carried great stigma. Similarly, homosexuality until 1980 was also considered a psychiatric disorder until it was removed on the basis of it being understood as a natural example of human variation. Scientifically, there is no standard or model for the human brain. So how should neurological differences such as dyslexia, autism, and ADHD be considered? Disability, diversity, or a combination? This conversation has implications for education, the field of psychology, and research in neuroscience. My research and discussion will focus on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, and autism spectrum disorder. As you might be able to tell from the names of these, they've been classified and conceptualized as disorders with disorder, dyslexia, and autism spectrum disorder. They have various challenges. In ADHD, there's impulsive behavior, hyperactivity, a lack of concentration, and distractibility. Dyslexic people have difficulties reading, writing, and spelling. And autistic individuals have social difficulties, speech and language difficulties, and sensory sensitivities. New research is painting a new picture, or at least a new perspective, that there's actually strengths, talents, and abilities that accompany these differences. So let's think about the words. So this was from a researcher from the University of Cambridge, their psychiatry department, and he was interested in the conceptualization of autism and in the words disorder and disability. So disorder is something that there's nothing positive about it, and despite trying different environmental modifications, the person is unable to function. Whereas a disability, a person falls below an average level of functioning, whether physical or psychological, but changes or modifications in the environment could make them reach a functional level. During the 20th century, for the past 100 years, brain differences were only considered to be disorders that had no benefit. Previously, research had only focused on measuring these differences and in the specific ways that they impair individuals, but it didn't really consider the strengths or talents. Learning disabilities are very common. 1 in 5 students in the US has difficulty with learning and attention, and 43% of parents wouldn't want others to know if their child had a learning disability. So there's a lot of stigma associated with it, and that has been it's kind of like the chicken and egg situation. It's not really clear whether the stigma came from research or if just the way that the world like perceived these people caused some of the stigma, or maybe a combination. But yeah. So neurodiversity, the concept originated from this Australian sociologist Judy Singer in the late 1990s, and she has Asperger's syndrome, and she was a proponent for the recognition of neurodiversity on the basis of she wanted to articulate like the needs of people, not all autistic people, but for herself and some other people that that they didn't want to be defined by a disability label, and that they instead wished to be seen as neurologically different. So neurodiversity, it's kind of along the lines of the ecological concept of biodiversity, and the concept was actually popularized when this journalist Harvey Bloom wrote an essay, and in that essay he had a famous quote: "Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment?" So he kind of brought to light this question of, you know, for different neurological differences, there might be impairments, there might be relative deficits, but it might have more to do with their interaction with an environment that is designed for a different type of brain than an inherent flaw or disorder of the individual. So this concept spans a lot of different areas. For research, it's kind of shifting how it's shifting the direction of research, in that now a lot more researchers are looking into the strengths and like the talents of these conditions, and a social implication and kind of a emerging possible civil rights issue with it is that neurological diversity may be on par with other diversities such as sexual orientation, being left-handed, right-handed. And it's also a field of study that is drawing a lot of attention in ethics, neuroscience, psychology, and education. The social model of disability is in contrast to the medical model of disability, believes that disability is not inherently a disorder. It proposes that the abilities, assets, and strengths of people whose neurology varies from the norm should be given equal attention as their deficits and disabilities. So now I'm going to share some of the research I did. So there was these researchers from Brown University's medical school, and they looked at dyslexic individuals in a controlled study. So it was randomized, and they had control subjects and dyslexic subjects. And what they found is something called the global visual spatial abilities, and I'm going to get more into that in a minute. They could also they found that they could process information faster. That was from another study. Another interesting thing, dyslexia is actually overrepresented in certain professions where visual spatial talents could be advantageous, such as radiology, physics, molecular biology, genetics, and engineering. So this is the study, this is the way that they conducted the study I just talked about. What the researchers did is they took the dyslexic subjects and the control subjects, and they measured how fast they could identify what is known as impossible objects. You might be familiar with M.C. Escher's artwork. He utilized a lot of it, and basically it's a scenario where a shape could look like it could exist in 3 dimensions when you look at a part of it, but when you I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. I'm gonna kind of point out. So if you look at only a part of this, you won't see that it couldn't exist in 3 dimensions. For example, if you look at this whole image, if you only look at the bottom, there appears to be 3 solid lines, but then when you look at the top, it's different. So dyslexic individuals, because of, they believe it's because of a difference in right hemisphere and left hemisphere of the brain, the symmetry of them, they found that dyslexic individuals could identify these faster and more accurately than control subjects. And they believe this has implications for MRI technology and other fields. So some of the strengths of autism. So autism, people with autism have nonverbal, exceptional nonverbal intelligence and visual thinking abilities. They also have systemizing abilities. So they're able to look at a complex pattern and identify small details in it. And what's pretty interesting, technology companies have actually recently started recruiting autistic individuals for this very reason. I read something where there was a company that started hiring autistic individuals as a part of a neurodiversity startup. And what they found is the people with autism were able to analyze this healthcare data that would take neurotypical employees up to a year in just 2 months. And they also have exceptional sequencing and logical reasoning abilities. And now some of the strengths of ADHD. Although it's typically seen as an impairment or something not positive in a classroom situation, daydreaming is actually associated with the creativity and the novelty seeking components of ADHD. So people with ADHD, they have problem solving because of their differences in their brain that cause more creativity. They're able to find like novel solutions to problems and just approach things in unique ways because of the way that they think. And some of the implications of this research. There's the biggest takeaway from the researchers, they said that there's a lot more research needed in this area. The shift from more of the medical model to now the social neurodiversity model that's used in research and practice, it only started in the past 20 years or so. So this is a new area. A trait that may be impairing in some contexts could be advantageous in others. So inattention, daydreaming, it could be impairing in a classroom setting, and it could cause a disability for ADHD individuals, but that same trait can prove advantageous. Also, so kind of a takeaway is that researchers are suggesting that these conditions should be characterized not only by deficits, but also by strengths. So the current consensus of the research I read is that it's not really black or white. It's not that they think the correct way is a medical model or a social model. They think probably the most accurate representation would be like a hybrid of the two, taking the best of both, that both works the best in like playing to their strengths, but also their environments. So this discovery of these talents could lead to more effective educations and both helping these neurodiverse individuals discover talents or interests or capabilities that they may have not known that they had while they're still in school. And this could also end up leading to them entering fields of of professional work that they really excel in, that they may not have known that they could. For one thing I read that was really interesting, it's known that there's a lot of people with ADHD in emergency medicine because of their ability to just work in like really, I guess, thrive in fast-paced situations. And finally, so a more balanced view to neurological diversity could be to give equal attention to the capabilities instead of disproportionately focusing on weaknesses. And another takeaway is that disability and neurodiversity are not incompatible, but the concepts of disorder and neurodiversity are incompatible. And that's because you could recognize that there's an impairment that's caused by the individual's relation to the environment, causing a disability, but at the same time, the idea, if we take on the idea that we're recognizing human variation as normal or acceptable, then that wouldn't really fall under the framework of disorder. So this is a quote: "There is a need for more research on the strengths associated with the atypical patterns of neural functioning. Future research may help to clarify the extent of such strengths and environments in which strengths are enhanced." I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Beautiful job. I just think it's such an important alternative perspective that you're offering here. And I love the very real world application that you articulated at the end.
Thank you.
Let's see. There is a request for sharing your references slide,
Sure thing.
because obviously this is really important.
You still see my screen?
What's that?
Are you still able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think maybe Melissa intended, maybe I can send it to her after we're done here. Any questions for Jack? Rebecca, you want to unmute yourself? Rebecca?
There we go.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I can.
So I really enjoyed this paper. You did an excellent job, and it reminded me of work that I did early in my graduate work, talking to families with children with disabilities, and they often reported that it wasn't the quote disability that their children had that was trying or difficult, but the hardest thing that they faced was the reaction from others and the way in which society was organized and put together, that was really the significant difficulty that they faced. So just along those lines, your research, if you came across anything that looked at teacher training, thinking K through 12.
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
So I didn't end up including it in my PowerPoint, but a big part of my research was the application of neurodiversity in classrooms. So there's something called the Universal Design for Learning that's based off of something called the Universal Design. It's used, it's like the framework for making buildings and places accessible for people with physical handicaps. And that same idea of, the idea that there can't be a one-size-fits-all accessibility, but to make it for the greatest majority. That same idea has been applied to education, and the Universal Design for Learning basically seeks to like destigmatize like different learning styles and different. So it basically makes it so that instead of having like specific accommodations for these students, there would be the whole class would be set up to be accessible for everybody, for like visual learners, auditory learners, and like multiple ways of learning and multiple ways of like representing.
Great. Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Any other questions for Jack? Oh, Chris, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi.
Okay. Jack, I just first want to say this presentation was amazing. Very, very interesting. So my question is kind of aligns with Professor Lowe's question. So I don't know if you encountered any references to kind of the European models of education and how they're teaching their students, and how when they encounter these disabilities per se, how do they approach them versus what the United States is doing in terms of programs for their students, and kind of creating this neurodiverse kind of system for education and some of the other things.
I wasn't aware of that, but that sounds like a great idea. I'll look more into that. Do you know anything else about that?
No, not really. I just, it was just food for thought. It was something that came to my mind when you were presenting, especially, and I mean, like you mentioned, there's definitely, some interest in terms of education, and I was just, I've read similar things in terms of just the educational system. Especially in Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden, and versus our, the American model per se, where, one of the things that they do is they kind of eliminated tests because they believe that it falls under that IQ type of studies where they're trying to capture your intelligence versus at a snapshot, where really it should be, learning should be more of a open process type thing.
I agree. Yeah, that's a unique perspective. I want to look more into that. Do you know? I'm just curious. Do you know if there's a name for that, or just like European, or it's just like European learning, European education?
The way I found it just said like Scandinavian, education system versus, American model education system. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely look more into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Any other questions for Jack? All right, thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Joshua Budney. His presentation is entitled Human Trafficking in Connecticut. So Josh, look at you, you are all set. Awesome.
All right, can you see everything okay?
Yep, we can.
Fantastic. All right, well, hello everyone. It's really good to be here with all of you. Today I'll be sharing my research on the topic of human trafficking over the past year. And the reason I wanted to study human trafficking is because I had always heard of it. I heard that it was bad. I saw warnings about it, but I never really knew what it was, and I wanted to change that. And right off the bat, I'll admit, I know this is a heavy topic, but I really hope that everyone is able to learn something new about this as I did, because it is a very important one. So here's what we're going to look at today. So first and foremost, I just want everyone to have a basic understanding of what human trafficking is and of the different forms that it can take. And after that, we'll take a closer look at the situation in Connecticut and our very communities. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is the act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So basically, an individual is trafficked when they are forced or coerced into doing some sort of work against their will. And just notice how broad that definition is. Human trafficking is a $31 billion a year industry, and it is growing every year, and it is unfortunately set to overtake drug trafficking as the most profitable criminal industry in the world. This is a massive problem, and it's only getting bigger every year. There are an estimated 40 million victims worldwide, and that number is tentative because it is so hard to really estimate based on research, and it's just hard to identify in general. And this takes place nearly everywhere. This is a problem that affects every single country in the world. And it's not just something that happens over there or in other big cities or something like that. This happens, as we'll see, everywhere, and it affects us even on a very local level. So human trafficking can be broken into two categories. The first being labor trafficking, and that involves forcing an individual to work on a business, farm, or something like that for typically very little or no pay. And this can happen especially to illegal immigrants. They'll get hired under the table. It seems like a good idea at the beginning because they're desperate, they need a job. And then the person who hired them, a trafficker, will then force them to work, like I said, for little or no pay and in very poor conditions. The second type is sex trafficking, and this may be the one you're more familiar with. That is the coercion of an individual into some form of commercial sex work. And so my research focused specifically on sex trafficking and even more specifically on sex trafficking of minors. And that's what we're going to look at a little bit more in depth. So how does this happen? Like, how does an underage person become trafficked and forced into some sort of sex work? Well, every case is unique, but generally traffickers will target vulnerable youth. Minors who run away from home, are kicked out, have dysfunctional family lives, they're all particularly vulnerable to traffickers. A trafficker will exploit the needs of a minor to build a relationship and gain their trust. And part of the challenge of this crime is that it's not as straightforward as someone just getting kidnapped, driven to another city, and forced into sex work. More often, it looks like a minor who is kicked out of their home by their parents for whatever reason. They'll get approached by a trafficker who helps them find a place to stay, give them food, whatever else they need, and they'll create reliance. And then over time, this relationship will turn harmful. They'll introduce the idea of sex work, the threats and manipulation will begin. And something that's important to stress is this is not something that happens overnight. This grooming process can take months or years. And after this reliance is built, trust is established and fear is instilled. It makes it that much more difficult for the victim to leave, escape, seek help, talk about it, all those things. It is quite a complicated grooming process that happens that creates this mindset that's difficult to leave. So sex trafficking can take many forms. There really is no one definition of what it means to be trafficked. One example you can find online is of a 17-year-old who was a freshman in college, and she moved away from her family. She had a great relationship with her family, moved away to school, and she was approached by her trafficker very innocently. It was a guy a little bit older, in his 20s, and it started off as like a friendship, basically. But then over time, the relationship turned harmful. She was coerced into sex work by fear and threats, and she got locked into this cycle for about 2 years of her life. And during that time, her communication with her family was cut off, so it was really hard to get out of. And she wrote that she genuinely feared for her life if she were to try and escape. And that's one example. And unfortunately, a different type of example is during my time researching, I spoke with a police officer from the Meriden Police Department, and he shared this story, a local story about something in Connecticut. And it was how a mother was trafficking her 6-year-old daughter and selling her for commercial sex. Very, very horrific. And that girl is now 15 years old. She's out on her own. And obviously you can see she has no family support because her family was part of the problem, was the problem. And in this example, she wasn't kidnapped or transported anywhere. So you can see like the different styles and reasons and situations and circumstances that occur and mean for someone to be trafficked. So diving in a little bit closer to home, in 2018, there were 141 victims identified in Connecticut, and the majority of that number were sex trafficking victims. And now I know that number is not like a massive, massive number, but for how big Connecticut is, that number is far too large. That, if you just think about what that means, that's over 100 people in this state who are forced into some sort of commercial sex work against their will, and they will have to deal with the effects of that for the rest of their life. And some may never get out of it. It is absolutely horrifying. Also in Connecticut in 2018, 23 businesses were found to be fronts for human trafficking. That has a lot of definitions. It's a little bit broad, but there's something that really does occur. And then unfortunately also in Connecticut, Connecticut's kind of infamous for one particular area for human trafficking, and that's the Berlin Turnpike. And there's a whole book that you can read about this. But it's interesting. If you've ever been on the Berlin Turnpike, you might recall seeing like 100 motels. And growing up, I would drive through there and I'd see it, and I never understood why. But unfortunately, the motels are there because in the 90s and going on through today, it has been the front for a thriving human trafficking business. So it goes to show that this is really something that happens close to home. This here map shows the various confirmed trafficking cases in 2018. And again, you can just see that this isn't something that happens in one particular place or in a heavily populated place necessarily. I mean, we live wherever you're sitting right now, you may be sitting in one of those circles. You may live in one of these areas that's affected. And it really does affect everyone close to home and in their own communities. So taking a little closer look at what Connecticut has to help combat the issue and to fight the issue, Connecticut does have something called the Human Anti-Trafficking Response Team, HART, and that is a task force inside of the Department of Children and Families that's dedicated to fighting human trafficking. So they do a wide range of work. They work with law enforcement. They try and identify victims. They try and connect victims to various support that they might need. They do lobby for legislation, various things like that. So they do a lot of incredible work. There are also numerous non-governmental organizations, private nonprofits or what have you, that are dedicated to fighting human trafficking. And that takes many forms as well, spreading awareness, connecting victims with resources, all of those types of things that do a lot of good work. And then also, I'm summarizing a lot here for the sake of time, and I know that, but when it comes to legislation in Connecticut that's in place to combat the issue and to help victims, it needs work. So I had the opportunity to go to a public forum in Hartford that discussed various issues related to human trafficking, and some lawmakers were there, and they were discussing the challenges that come with actually prosecuting this crime. It's hard just because it's difficult to identify, because of, we talked about, it's so broad and each case is different. It can be very hard to put legislation in place that actually accounts for that. So that's certainly a work in progress and it needs to improve, but we do have some good resources there. And then finally, what can we do as college students or just citizens to help fight this problem? And I cannot stress this enough, and I hope that this is not news to you, but please do not be the demand for human trafficking. Unfortunately, this problem only exists because there are buyers for it. And until that fact goes away, it's tough that we'll ever really see an end to this problem. Anytime that you patronize a commercial sex service, unfortunately, you are very likely dealing with someone who is trafficked or doing this against their will. So please don't do that. Also, educating yourself and educating others is humongous to fighting this. This is a crime that thrives in complexity, in darkness, in misunderstanding. And if that changes, that'll be a large step in the right direction for actually seeing it come to an end. And of course, in an immediate emergency, do call 911, never be afraid to do that. And if you ever do suspect something, there are state and national hotlines to report and do anonymous tips for anything that you see. So do not be afraid to look up something like that if you ever feel the need to do that. And that's everything I have. So thank you for listening, and I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Josh. Beautiful job. Questions for Josh? Lisa, you want to unmute yourself, Lisa?
Hi, Joshua. My question is the percentages of victims. Did you talk about what percentages are male versus female?
I did not mention that, and I don't have a number right in front of me, but I can say that it is something in the 80% female to 20% male. It's a large majority are female, but it does affect males as well.
Elizabeth, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I just was wondering, how do you identify a trafficking victim?
So that's the million-dollar question, right? That's because it is very difficult for law enforcement to do that, and with more time, I'd be able to go into kind of the details of this. But basically, it is hard to identify a trafficking victim because often they themselves are scared to be found and they fear law enforcement. So it is difficult, and they don't immediately come forward or will tell you if asked. So looking for signs. In fact, actually, I do have something in front of me. The U.S. Department of Education made a fact sheet for teachers to try and identify symptoms of human trafficking. So various things like, especially for minors, this accounts for everyone. If they do not regularly attend school, has unexplained absences, makes frequent references to travel to other cities, if they have physical signs on them, shows signs of drug addiction, anything like that, anything out of the ordinary that kind of suggests that maybe they're not acting in a way you'd expect them to act, can be a sign that they are a trafficking victim.
Chris, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. So my question is there an, I know that there's, or let me back up. Is there an aspect to the human trafficking where they take the victims and they basically harvest their organs and sell them to like the black market? Is that an aspect of human trafficking, or is that its own complete different monster per se?
So that is a very specific case. I would say I have heard of that sort of thing as well, but largely, no, that's not like a major focus of what traffickers do. I do believe that happens, but largely, and I think that's one of the things I hope everyone can take away is that it's not as dramatic as that. It's something that's very close to home, but I do believe that does happen.
Thank you. Let's see. Eva, do you want to unmute yourself?
So Josh, great work. So I wanted to know a little bit more about whether your research might have addressed the fact that the larger political discussion around immigration often then leads to accusations of human trafficking coming from abroad. Do you think that assumptions, or those larger assumptions, maybe hide or overshadow the issues that this issue occurring in our local cities and towns?
That is a big question to answer, because I think people making that argument that I think what you're saying is like open borders, or you're saying the argument is that like open borders and more free-flowing immigration can lead to human trafficking. That is definitely a bit of a stretch to say that that's an argument for closed borders, because while sure, transporting across borders can happen and be a part of human trafficking, stopping immigration would not have any significant impact on the prominence of human trafficking in U.S. cities. So that would be a very big stretch.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Josh. And next, we have Ailish Frost speaking about the impact of a lack of specialized educational services. So Ailish, if you want to, yep, you're good. All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. So, hello, my name is Ailish Frost,
and I will be presenting on the impact of a lack of specialized educational services. I want to be a teacher when I graduate, and through my studies and experience, I have found this to be a real issue that I wanted to speak on today. So, learning disabilities are relatively common in the United States, with about 15% of people receiving a diagnosis for some form of a learning disability in their lifetime. On top of this, a vast number of American citizens have a physical disability of some kind, the total coming to about 56.7 million people with a physical disability in the United States. Young people with disabilities are 6% less likely to receive school-based academic help. And these young people are also more likely to have limited English proficiency, attend lower performing schools, experience bullying. They're suspended at higher rates and are generally less engaged in school and social activities. So with this many people needing services that adapt to their disabilities, it seems as though special education is becoming overwhelmingly necessary. Students that should have certain resources and support tend to fly under the radar and not always receive what they need, which has become a growing problem in education in the United States. So there is a Supreme Court case that deals with education for those with disabilities, which is the Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District RE1 case. This case implemented the Education for All Handicapped Children Act and influenced a lot of pieces of legislation of the same nature. These pieces of legislation all made it so that students with disabilities had to have access to necessary resources that would help them thrive in an academic setting. However, there is research that argues that special education services are currently insufficient and do not fulfill the requirements that are laid out in the Individuals with Disabilities Act. This has been speculated to be because the special education curriculum has lost its focus on providing intensive, data-driven, student-focused, individualized instruction. Special education, one of the main components of it is individualized instruction. So there was a study done in 2019 by Christopher Lemons where 60 teachers were observed, and in each of those teachers' classrooms, there was at least one student with a learning disability, and it was found that the students with disabilities received undifferentiated instruction. This caused these students to be less engaged, they contributed less, and they tended to ask fewer questions in the classroom. So is there a lack of specialized resources? You know, what's the proof of that? So there have been a couple studies that deal with this. One of them was that I'm going to talk about was conducted to see how long students get specialized services depending on their diagnoses through 3 grade levels. So students that were diagnosed and actively recognized as having a specific learning disability received assistance through all 3 grades. So say that they were looking at students from 1st to 3rd grade. Students that were diagnosed at the beginning of 1st grade were actively received accommodations through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade if their learning disability was visible. Students with no diagnosis therefore received no services. And so the problem occurs when it was found that a large group of students only received services for 1 or 2 grades if they were identified with a specific learning disability at the beginning of the year or at a young age. Their diagnosis doesn't always follow them, and so accommodations don't always follow them through grade levels. You also find problems where some students go undiagnosed and therefore wouldn't receive the services they need to succeed in school and then later in life. So with recent trends, it has become increasingly uncertain whether these services are being adequately offered now, let alone in the future. So there's been a demonstrated need for more special education teachers and paraprofessionals. A lack of special education teachers and paraprofessionals, it could lead to a decline in quality specialized educational services. Paraprofessionals provide aid and support to students with special needs under the guidance of credentialed teachers. Paraprofessionals can work with children that have any disability, though they do most commonly work with children with learning or behavioral disorders. When it comes to physical disabilities, there was a study that found that teachers of the deaf and speech language pathologists saw themselves as having only moderate knowledge and competence in working with children who are deaf or hard of hearing. This lack of confidence impacts the quality of instruction for these students. The teachers in this study cited their lack of confidence as possibly coming from a lack of support from their school and a lack of professional development opportunities to build their special education skills. So what is the impact? Individualized instruction is vital to special education students. So a lack of resources could have drastic impacts on classroom instruction. Less educators means bigger class sizes and less one-on-one instruction. So since one-on-one instruction is so integral to special education, this really would jeopardize their education. Referring back to a study I discussed earlier, where researchers looked at how long a diagnosis and accommodations would follow a student, when a specific learning disability isn't easily recognizable and visible, and the students stop receiving services, they fall below their peers in proficiency and starting performance as they move up in grade levels, which is obviously a massively negative impact of not having adequate resources. So we looked at what are the bad things that happen when you don't have these services, but what are the good things that happen when you do have these services? So there was a study that was conducted at the Henry Viscardi School. HVS is a division of the National Center for Disability Services, and they provide all of the state-mandated resources and services outlined in the Individuals with Disabilities Act. There was a survey that was given to their students, and the surveys were reviewed for major indications of integration into society after they graduated from high school. So we're looking at things like entering four-year institutions and being competitively employed. So ultimately, the conclusion that they came to was that specialized services benefited these students. 60.7% of them enrolled in a four-year college compared to the national average for students with disabilities of 55.7. The study also found a vast difference in employment. So the national average for students with disabilities being competitively employed is 30.4%, where HVS students beat this number by showing an average of 42.9% of students being competitively employed. All the positive results were attributed to the services that were provided to them at HVS. So then how do we fix a problem like this? So researchers there was a study where researchers observed the instruction of 20 educators in grades 4 and 5. They found a variety of tactics to potentially help teachers better assist disabled students. One of these being a constant implementation of foundational skills, such as phonics, while teaching higher level skills like comprehension. It's basically the idea that you continue to reinforce base level skills as you progress in difficulty. This study also discusses things like peer-mediated and round-robin reading, finding that peer-mediated reading causes improved reading outcomes for students with disabilities. Reading comprehension is one of those base-level skills that's extremely important when it comes to special education. Increased opportunities for professional development is also strongly encouraged so that educators feel knowledgeable and supported as they face challenges. Improving professional development and providing support for these educators is bound to help no matter which disability they come in contact with every day, whether that be a learning disability, behavioral, or a physical disability. So in conclusion, many students need special education, and the matter of providing these services is becoming increasingly relevant and important. There are court cases and laws in place that dictate the right to specialized services and show its importance, as there are many studies examining the need for specialized services and documenting the positive effects of these services. There is a need for more special education teachers and paraprofessionals, and the ones that are currently teaching often lack necessary training, resources, and confidence. This lack of materials and educators will have negative effects on the students by not allowing them to reach their full potential. And when it comes to education and teaching in general, there should be nothing more important than a student's success. And educators should be willing to go to any length to ensure their students' success. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening. Does anybody have any questions?
Very nice, Ailish. Another really important topic. Do we have any questions for Ailish? Anyone? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Nice job.
Thank you.
You are officially off the hook. Okay. Next up is Jake Hesseltine. Jake will be discussing combating physician suicide. So let's get you going, Jake.
All right, hello.
Hi.
There we go.
There you are. Fabulous.
I could share my quick screen real quick. Okay. All right, is that good? Can you see that?
It's loading. There it is. Great.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jake Hesselton, and I'm going to be talking about physician suicide and how we could do something about it. So when the average person gets sick or injured, the first thing we do is call our doctors or go to the hospital. But if the people treating us are the ones that need treatment, what chance do you really stand? Right? What chance do any of us stand? Modern medicine is definitely a miracle in every sense of the word, and I think we can all agree on that. But I feel that society generally overlooks the mental health of the people in the healthcare industry. And that is a serious problem. And my research has shown me that the suicide rates for these professions are dangerously high. And they've gone largely unnoticed. So especially lately, we've seen with the spread of COVID-19, these doctors are putting in, like, they're working back-breaking shifts. They're getting cuts on their faces where their masks are. They're really putting themselves in harm's way to help us. And I feel like we owe them that kind of respect and help in return. So yeah, so today I'm going to discuss proof of this problem, the difficulties in combating it, and a possible solution. So this is the slide. I kind of skipped over that one. But I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, how bad could this really be? I haven't heard anything about this in the news. And I'm sure if it was anything significant, then it would have come to my knowledge. And I agree with you. This can make it sound like some kind of unsubstantiated rumor, especially when nobody's talking about it. But from my research, I've found that a 2018 cross-examination of studies from the past decade indicate that the suicide rate among physicians is between 28 to 40 per 100,000 people, whereas the average US population is only 12.3 per 100,000. So let this number sink in. I know it's easy to get wrapped up in all these statistics, but this means that the best case scenario is that physicians are killing themselves at double the national average. That's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, over 3 times. I think the exact number was like 3.25 to be exact, but and this doesn't even take into account failed attempts, people that are at risk but don't speak up. So this is a severe problem. The same study indicates that males are 70% more likely to commit suicide as physicians than they would be in other professions. And females are 250% to 400% more likely to commit suicide as physicians. That's scary. I don't think I have to say that. That is frightening. So, and if that wasn't enough proof, these same studies indicate that around 300 to 400 physicians commit suicide per year. And this is a little disputed, that statistic, but we'll talk about that later. But regardless, there's clearly a problem that needs to be addressed, and I don't think we're doing enough to do that. So one of the most common reasons for suicide is mental burnout among healthcare professionals. And this really doesn't come as much of a surprise, right? The amount of stress these people undergo on a day-to-day basis is mind-boggling. Like, imagine being the one having to tell a family that their kid didn't make it through surgery, right? This is their job. This is their 9 to 5. So it makes sense that this would be so mentally taxing on them. But as I said, not much is being done to address this. And one reason for this is a fear for the reputation. I think we all know that society as a whole has become much more understanding of mental illnesses and, suicidal thoughts and helping these people. But unfortunately, this is not the case for the social cliques in these medical professions. And the chief medical officer at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Dr. Christine Motier, that's the quote I have on the left. Her research in the field has led me to believe, and others to believe, that these social cliques are very unforgiving, which is surprising. You would think that since these doctors are all going through the same thing, that they would be able to communicate that better with other doctors than anybody else. But that's just not the case. It seems that this is reinforced by a Health and Medicine Scientific Journal in 2019, basically just reiterating the same points. There's a very competitive nature in many of these practices, which leads most doctors to kind of bottle all of this up because they feel like they'll be giving the competition a leg up if they share some of the troubles they might be having. So this is really a problem because I know it's important that the doctors are trained to put their patients first, as is the case, but this leads them to put themselves second and third and fourth, and eventually they're not even a concern to themselves. And this is a reason for mental burnout, and as I said, a very serious problem in suicide. So this leads into the next problem, which is very few physicians are willing to provide information about themselves to aid further study of the topic, which leads to a lack of information overall, right? It's really hard for researchers to accumulate any exact information about this topic because everybody's so secretive. If more people would speak up, then maybe this is why we're not seeing it in the news very much, right? How can you report on something if you don't have all the statistics? And this brings us back to what I said earlier, that 300 to 400 deaths per year statistic. That was on the website for the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, but they actually took that off their website recently with a statement that it just wasn't an exact enough statistic to be used in like clinics and research studies. And you might think this kind of disproves my point, but I would argue that it reinforces it. This shows how disorganized the study of this field really is, right? The number one suicide prevention organization in the country can't even put a proper statistic on the website because they don't have the facts to back it up. So this makes it really unlikely to be able to receive funding from the state or federal level because, as I said, if you can't prove that this problem exists without just estimates, it's hard to receive funding. They're not going to want to put their money towards that. And there's also more technology that could be used if we had this kind of information, right? A 2011 neural mapping technology, it was basically, it was a study on suicidal youths where basically they're, as you can see in that figure there, a machine mapped their brain waves in certain areas to determine common areas of agitation among suicidal individuals. And while this did work, this technology exists and it was available in 2011, but it's really not being used on this particular focus group because there's not enough specific information to back it up. So we really need a way to get some detailed information on this if we want to make any progress. And this leads us to the ultimate question, right? How do we solve this when there are so many contributing factors? We know that this has to protect the identities of these healthcare workers to make sure they feel comfortable providing information, and then we need to get that information and record it on an individual level. So my proposed solution is that we implement some kind of mandatory therapy quota for all medical practitioners. And this might sound like a little bit of a drastic solution, but when you think about it, if we put all medical workers on the same page, there's really no there's no worry about feeling targeted. These people that are too afraid to speak out aren't doing it without some kind of outside assistance. So if we want to fix that, I feel like a really good way to do that would just be make it mandatory. Everybody has to go through this, and it wouldn't be as extensive for everybody. Obviously, there would be some kind of like preliminary evaluation, and then the people that need to be referred to, more help would do so. But it would be a good way to weed those people out and make them feel like their voices are being heard without singling them out in front of their peers. In addition to this, it would allow for the collection of verifiable individual data. As I said, that's severely lacking. But if we can talk to these people one by one and record like their emotions, how they feel about certain things, what could be altered, I believe that would not only help them, but it would help people in the future suffering from this same condition. And obviously this information would be kept anonymous to protect their reputations, but I believe that this is an important stride in gaining financial support. If you can put forward a statistic, say X amount of people are feeling this way, and we can fix that by A, B, and C, that's going to get the funding. And it might sound a little pessimistic to think about it on that kind of a level, but I feel like it would be naive not to consider the numbers involved. And from what I found, therapy on average in the United States costs around $50 per session with insurance. So I believe the best way to do this would have, the government, state or federal, pay for the preliminary evaluation, and then the people that would be referred would do so with their healthcare program. So basically, oh, and one thing I almost missed. This would provide a solid foundation to apply that brain mapping technology I discussed earlier. As I said, there's too broad of a focus group to really use it now, but if we have this in place, I believe it would be much easier to apply this kind of technology and find out even more information on the topic. So things really aren't going to get better unless something changes. Doctors just need to be healthy in order to be able to treat their patients, and there's definitely not enough being done to ensure this. I feel this issue needs a lot more attention than it's gotten. As I said before, these doctors are putting their lives on the line every day, especially recently, and I believe that it's time somebody tries to save them. So thank you, and I'll take any questions now.
Very nice job, Jake.
Thank you.
Rebecca Lowe, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's such an interesting topic, Jake. And so I'm just wondering if you found in your research any proposals or policy recommendations or insight from physicians themselves about what physicians think should be the next step in addressing this problem.
So from what I've seen, I have seen a number of stories from physicians, or most of them were actually from people that knew the physicians to kind of protect their, like I said, the reputation, the identity. Not many of them really had a proposed idea. It was really just people putting their voices out there to try to help others with their own personal story. And of course, I might have missed some, but in general, that's what I was seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Jones?
Jay, can you share the statistics, those male and female stats? Where did they come from?
So let me dig through the archives here. I don't know if I could get the exact thing. I have it in the references. Let me see if it's here. I believe it was this. I don't know if you can see my mouse, the Castrolucci one. I believe that was it. And I'll go through that again. And if you want, I could send you.
Oh yeah, that'd be cool if you could. I mean, those are alarming stats. Those are crazy.
Yes. And, like I said, of course, that's just, well, it's not just one study. It was a analysis of several studies, but that conclusion was just one person. I believe that more evidence would really help back this up. But I think we definitely know enough to recognize that there's a problem.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dr. Maslin.
Hi, Jake. You did a great job. Really enjoyed that presentation. I'm wondering again about the stats, where veterans fit into this. I know veterans have a very high high rate of suicide, and I'm wondering if you know if you could compare the rate of suicide among veterans as compared to medical professionals, and also related to that, whether the veteran population, I'm assuming, is included in the general population as a whole.
Mhm.
The stats for the general population as a whole that you compared?
Yeah, so as far as specifics on veteran suicide rates, that really wasn't part of my project, but that's definitely a worthwhile thing to look into and compare just to get a better frame of reference. Yeah, I didn't come across that, and my focus was really on just physicians and people in the healthcare industry, but I think that would be a worthwhile thing to look into.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jacob Murphy.
So first of all, I audibly swore when you presented the numbers on the sheer number of physicians who will commit suicide when compared to the general.
It's surprising,
Yeah,
right?
it was absolutely insane. I had no idea it was that much higher. So my question is sort of twofold, and I apologize if maybe I missed this detail during your presentation. But when you say physicians, I assume you're talking about people like medical doctors, surgeons, et cetera, those types of medical professionals. Exactly. Okay, so did you happen to find any data relating to nurses, CNAs, and those other types of healthcare workers?
Not specifically, but for a lot of the statistics I looked at, when I say healthcare workers, it kind of includes, doctors, nurses, everybody in that line of work. And I believe those were included in many of the statistics I saw, to my knowledge. I could definitely be wrong, but that's the way I took it when I was researching this.
Okay, perfect.
But as far as like just nurses, I don't have anything just on that, but they are included in this, to my knowledge.
Thank you, Jacob. Any other questions for Jake? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jake. Nice job.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Lexi McNeil, who will be presenting on breaking the cycle of revolving door patients in psychiatric facilities. So Lexi, where are you? There you are. There you go. Fabulous. There you are.
Okay, hello. So there's a term within the psychiatric community that refers to patients who constantly seek readmission, and that is revolving door patients. They tend to be difficult to treat and costly, and they tend to make up a large portion of the people who are being admitted. Someone leaving a psychiatric facility only to end up back there kind of defeats the whole point of them being there to begin with. And as you can see, it's very costly for people to be in psychiatric facilities, anywhere between $7,200 to $8,600 for just anyone in general. And so when about half the people coming in have already been to a psychiatric facility, it makes you wonder what's going on and what are the risk factors here. And so the most common readmission diagnosis are mood disorders like bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression, followed by schizophrenia independently. And there's been the belief, or at least what I've heard, that a lot of people believe ethnicity plays a role, race and ethnicity plays a role in admission and readmission. But from the studies I found, that it was that race and ethnicity independently played virtually no role, which kind of just highlights the fact that mental illness doesn't really discriminate, and that's a nice thing to be able to like check off the list of risk factors. And one factor that seems kind of paradoxical is that the more admissions someone has had in the past, the more likely they are to come back. So it's almost like this loop just keeps going on, and it becomes harder and harder to break. And instability in someone's home environment can also cause a problem, and for them to return. In a study on children, it was found that welfare programs, unemployment, and unstable living environments cause their return. And it makes sense. If you're not going home to somewhere safe, you're going to want to return to where it is safe. And family is obviously a very big part of recovering from any mental illness. The less time patients spend in acute care, the better their prognosis seems to be. Care between 11 to 30 days produces the best outcomes. Longer hospital stays tend to reflect more severe illnesses such as substance abuse or schizophrenia, where the treatment is more dynamic, so people are more likely to relapse and then come back. And one interesting thing I found was that the time of year also plays a role in readmissions. People are readmitted more frequently in the fall, which I guess kind of just lines up with the belief that people get more depressed in the winter. So obviously there are a lot of risk factors and a lot of things that a lot of things that happen, but I think the bigger question is what can be done and what can we do to help these people? Many acute facilities have outpatient programs, but not a lot of people comply with them. As you can see, only 1/3 of patients follow up after a discharge, which is kind of shocking considering, like, if you have your knee replaced, you're going to want to go to your post-op appointments. But it doesn't seem to be the case with people in psychiatric facilities. Intervention programs have shown some benefit in helping patients stay out of psychiatric hospitals. In one study, intervention methods lowered readmission rates by 2.59%, which is a small number, but it's better than nothing. And one tool that has been found to be helpful is the tool of empowerment, and that's defined by many different people in many different ways. But one definition is that it focuses attention on the degree of direct control individuals have over their own lives and their own abilities. Empowerment can be said to be broken down into 3 parts. First, there is a sense of personal confidence and self-esteem and an acceptance of a diagnosis. And then the second is self-determination to make choices in life and make choices in their own treatment. And then third is a social engagement, where you have shared feelings of social injustices and you support other people as well. And while empowerment has been shown to be helpful with people who have more mild symptoms, it seems the worse someone's illness gets, the less effective it is. So it should be rendered more of a preventative measure than a curative treatment, but it does show a lot of promise in helping people. And I'd like to just mention the fact that there are 2 variables in psychiatric readmissions, one being the patient and the other being the hospital. I at one point was admitted to 2 psychiatric facilities in under a year, which could have classified me as a revolving door patient to some extent. However, my readmission would not have happened if I had been diagnosed properly the first time. Before my second hospitalization, I had been told by multiple doctors and therapists, and that because I didn't have certain symptoms of an illness, because I didn't have any family history, because of this and that, then I couldn't have that illness. But when I was hospitalized the second time, I had to pretty much convince my doctors that this is what was wrong with me. And then that they were then able to prove that. And I do see the problem where a lot of the times those who enter psychiatric facilities are delusional or not thinking clearly, but sometimes patients who have lived with themselves their whole lives have an understanding that doctors don't. And I think the cycle of readmission can be broken for a lot of individuals if there can be this understanding that, okay, this patient doesn't have an MD, but they have a degree in themselves. And when treating mental illness, I just wholeheartedly believe that physicians and hospital facilities need to take the patient's analysis of their own condition into consideration. I believe doing that will help avoid other patients from unnecessary suffering and the incorrect diagnosis and conclusions of them being revolving door patients when it wasn't their own intuition that failed them, but rather the hospitals. And then that's it.
Thank you, Lexi. It feels a little strange to applaud at this moment, but you did a really nice job. And I really appreciate you echoing something that my students always hear me talk about, which is the importance of self-advocating, particularly in a medical or psychiatric setting. And you also echoed the point that we are each experts on our own bodies. So it just reiterates the rationale for why it's so important to self-advocate. So thank you for sharing your own personal story to further illustrate that point. Are there any questions for Lexi? I'm just scanning through these. All right, it looks like we don't have any questions. All right, thank you so much, Lexi. Okay, next up we have Ayal Rosen, who will be presenting on fear, it is good for you. So Ayal, let's get you going.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, I like your background.
Fits the topic, I thought.
It sure does.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm doing this correctly, about sharing the video. Okay. So, share screen. Okay. Is it visible?
We do not see your screen at the moment.
It seems like, 1 second. Yeah, okay. It seems like I'm using a different computer, and right now it's, I try to share and it tells me there's a security thing that doesn't allow me to share.
All right.
Do you want to jump to the next person and I'll try to figure out?
Sure.
Okay.
That's okay with Jasenia. Yes, Jasenia. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's get your video going. All right, thank you for being flexible.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay.
So that's blocking, that screen is blocking the slides for us.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, I see what I did wrong. Okay. Better?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Jasenia Sterling, and my presentation is an evaluation of child protective services in the United States. So for the purpose of this presentation, Child Welfare, Child Protective Services, or CPS, and the Department of Children and Families, DCF, will be used interchangeably. I want to also briefly mention that I chose this topic because I plan on becoming a social worker for DCF in the future, and I just felt that it was important for me to learn more about the system, but also to inform others that it no longer deserves its outdated reputation. So let's get started. According to the authors Kimberly Crosslin and Glenn Dunlap of the article, Running Away from Foster Care, What Do We Know and What Do We Do? This system is a national disgrace. and too dysfunctional to effectively meet the needs of the children in their care. But DCF's mission statement says that they partner with communities and empower families to raise resilient children who thrive. And they do this by utilizing the 5-step method seen on the right. It includes safety, permanency, racial justice, well-being, and a workforce. So given the contrast between its mission and its reputation, it's important to examine Child Protective Services history in order to determine whether it is truly fulfilling its mission. And so we can do this by starting at the beginning. So in the 1600s, the first historical records demonstrate that criminal charges were brought against perpetrators for the harm of a child in the United States. In the 1800s, many places encouraged the poor laws, which allowed people to take in abandoned, orphaned, or neglected children from off the streets and place them in indentured service. During this time, there was approximately 30,000 children living on the streets of New York City fending for themselves. And although there were orphanages, conditions in these places were appalling, with mortality rates reaching 60 to 80% due to infectious diseases. Before the mid-19th century, no one had really taken on the responsibility of caring for America's underprivileged youth until a young American clergyman named Charles Loring Brace was inspired by these children's plights. And he says, "When a child of the streets stands before you in rags with a tear-stained face, you cannot easily forget him, and yet you are perplexed what to do. The human soul is difficult to interfere with, and you hesitate how far you should go." Brace became the founder of what is now known as the Orphan Train movement, and it essentially took children from off the streets of New York City and sent them across the US to families willing to take them in. In 1853, the first train was sent out with 45 children to Dowagiac, Michigan, and were chosen by farming families. Others were inspired by Brace's work and began the movement in their own states. And by 1929, the program had ended and approximately 200,000 children had been relocated to 48 states across the US. And this movement is now considered the start of the modern foster care system. So next, I want to talk about DCF's negative reputation. And the Department of Children and Families' reputation comes from its long history of failing children in the system, specifically when it comes to discrimination. The child welfare system is really no exception to it. The system has shown prejudice against race, income, gender, and marital status. And this is seen in a study done for the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry. And they conducted a comparison in the probability of removal cases for different races, and it demonstrated significant differences. So compared to white children, Black children were 15% more likely to be removed from their homes. American Indian and Alaskan Native children were 23% more likely. Multiracial children were 43% more likely. And in contrast, Asian children were 34% less likely, and Hispanic children were also 3% less likely. When comparing 1 or 2 parent households, children in single parent households were 9% more likely to be removed. And when looking at socioeconomic differences, children living in predominantly Black counties that had higher poverty rates and juvenile arrest were 10% more likely to be removed as well. So not only is DCF at fault for the racial discrimination that's seen above, but it is also blamed for a higher mental and physical illness in foster children. And this is seen in a 2011-2012 National Survey of Children's Health. And they surveyed over 900,000 children from various backgrounds. 1.3% of these children were in the foster care system currently or at some point in their lives. And compared to children who had not been in the foster care system, children in the system were 7 times as likely to be depressed, 6 times as likely to have behavioral health problems, 5 times as likely to experience or feel anxiety, 3 times as likely to have ADHD, a hearing or a vision impairment, and twice as likely to have trouble learning, delayed development, asthma, obesity, and problems with their speech. It is important to note here, though, that not all problems foster children develop is from their time in the foster care system, as they could have had health problems that originated from their problematic home situations. So it's important to acknowledge, though, that the foster care system's failures would only exacerbate the issues children are having after being taken from a negative environment. So now I want to move on to talking about the positive aspects of DCF. And I want to mention that DCF does understand that their system is flawed and that much change needs to take place in order to make it more efficient and effective at what it does. And this is why it is constantly creating new programs and initiatives to improve the lives of the children and families that they work with. So DCF has created new policies to reduce the amount of racial discrimination. For example, in 1994 and 96, new policies were created such as the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act and the Inter-Ethnic Adoption Provision of the Small Business Job Protection Act. And these acts were put in place to create a more colorblind approach to interacting with children and families, especially when working with the African American population. They have also created new programs that reduce DCF's involvement in the lives of children and families, specifically children, so that it does not disrupt their developmental growth. And so a study, 15-year study found that about 3,300 fewer children were in DCF's care in the state of Connecticut. And under new programs developed to limit DCF's involvement, the differential response system and the family assessment response, 860 families were referred to community agencies for help in 2012 rather than having DCF involvement, like I said before, which disrupts the family and especially the child's life. In 2014, the number grew to 1,878, again, due to the response systems that were put in place. And an additional 740 families were referred to other programs and services. Since 2011, the department has invested over $58 million in community-based services. And they really do want to limit their involvement in the lives of families if they can. So DCF also values the opinion of the children and families in their care, and they take time to collect feedback in order to make improvements. So in Connecticut, DCF conducted a foster home quality and satisfaction survey to determine the overall satisfaction of services provided to foster children and families. They chose a random sample of 225 children and 221 foster parents. And they found there was an overall high satisfaction rate of 85% for foster children and 79% for foster parents. As far as foster home placements, 71% of children were with non-relative families and 23% were with relatives. 97% of children reported that they felt safe in their foster homes. 96% felt that their basic needs were being met. And 95% felt that their foster parents understood their background well enough. So in conclusion, when examining surveys and statistical data, it can be concluded that there is an overwhelming amount of data that supports both Child Protective Services positive and negative aspects. And as with any public service in the United States, Child Protective Services and the foster care system have their share of flaws, but the overall purpose of the department has always been to help. And despite its shortcomings, it has served countless children and families across the United States. So here are some of my references, and thank you for listening to my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Very nice job, Jasenia. Emily Canto has a question. Emily, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, what a wonderful job. I appreciate the work that you did.
Thank you.
Within any of the data that you were collecting about youth, did they identify depression, anxiety, et cetera, statistics based on the age in which the youth entered into the system?
No, they didn't.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions for Jasenia? Okay, thank you so much. Beautiful job.
Thank you.
All right, Ayal, how's it looking?
I think that, okay, let's test it now. Start my video. Okay, let's see. Share screen. Yeah, okay, it's gonna work.
All right, so Ayal Rosen, presenting Fear, It Is Good For You.
Hi, everybody. Okay, without all the technical difficulties, this is gonna be my presentation about fear. It's good for you. And of course, it jumped to the last. Here we go, sorry about that. Fear, it's good for you. The scary facts behind popular forms of entertainment. But first, I wanna ask, what is fear? According to the dictionary, fear is an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. A person who experiences fear goes through physiological changes, most notably the fight or flight response. When that occurs, a person either is going to run away or confront the threat. Same as the physiological changes, there are also noticeable physical changes as response to fear. A person would start to breathe faster, their muscle would tense up, their heart would start to pound fast, and they would start sweating. Both the physiological and the physical changes are both associated with negative outcomes to fear. So I want to go back to the definition of what is fear. If we, I want to draw your attention to a keyword in this definition, unpleasant. So despite this unpleasant perception, there are industries that use fear as a form of entertainment. I decided to go with the theme park industry, the film movie industry, and the haunted attraction industry. So the attraction to thrill ride, specifically the roller coaster, started in Russia during the 17th century. At the beginning, roller coasters were fast, unsafe, and injury and death were very common. But later, they became more popular in the United States with the introduction of the modern coaster by Disneyland. With people now able to ride coaster safely, it became one of the most popular attractions in most theme parks. Margie Kerr, which is, she is a sociologist who studied fear and its effects. She decided to put herself through many forms of fear-inducing tests. One of them was riding roller coasters. As noted, she had normal symptoms of a person who is facing fear. So why would she put herself through an unpleasant experience such as this? She wanted to understand if there are any positive outcomes to being fear. Her research showed that being on a roller coaster or a thrill ride, the brain delivers the same stimuli as that fight depression. In addition, the brain is sending signals that makes the body feel better. It is because the brain is telling the body that it went through a really fearful experience and you came out safely. Another research that she found is that children enjoy this thrill ride, particularly because their bodies are still young and it allows them to recuperate quickly and enjoy the loss of control. For children, they are still learning how their body works and how how their sense of balance work. And now with the horror movie industry, first saw success during the Great Depression in the 1930s with movies like Dracula, The Invisible Man, and Frankenstein. People will flock in the theaters because they wanted to escape reality and face an enemy they know is going to be defeated at the end. Unlike roller coaster, where people put their bodies through physical experience, the movie screen provides a way to face fear in a calmer environment. People can still face itself and test their limits. And if they're not comfortable, it's just easy to look away. So what is a haunted attraction? Okay. Unless you go to, sorry about that. Okay. Unless you go to a haunted attraction, most people don't know what it is. Haunted attraction immerses their audience with actors, props, costumes, sound, and lighting, and utilizing stage effect to create a unique personal experience. People can traverse the space and discover narrative rather than it being offered on the screen. There are many types of haunted attraction. They change by the size of the haunt, number of actors, and how many customers can be put through. And also depends on the location of where the haunt is. Haunted attraction became more popular during the 1970s and spread across the country ever since. Each year, more haunted attractions are being built and more people just flock them. Margie Kerr wanted to dig deeper into the research of fear. She decided to use her love for haunted attraction and to learn why it is such a popular form of entertainment. In her research, she collected almost 100 brain scans and over 250 customer surveys before and after the individual walked through a haunted attraction. The participants had to rate their mood on a scale to 1 to 10 before they went into the haunt and immediately after they exited. People who had the brain scans taken had to perform cognitive tests after their experience. Going back to Kerr's research, fear had many positive results. Overall, the participants' mood had significantly changed to the better. And not just that, the brain scan showed that they were actually happy. These people were more relaxed when asked to perform cognitive tasks like jumping jacks and do like small puzzles. They were able to not think and just do the task. And their mental chatter lowered and their minds were clear and sharp. Since I don't have any brain scan, I don't have a brain scanner, I decided to create my little experiment as well and try to recreate it. I had a willing participant who had never been to a haunted attraction. And before we walked in, she showed a high level of anxiety and fear. I just want you to pay attention to her body language and how she acts. So going back to how fear manifests in a person, she showed all of these points. Her breathing was fast, her muscles were tensing up, her heart was pounding fast, and she was sweating. Also, one thing that I had to cut out from the video, she refuses to break contact from the person behind her that was her friend to help her, and also me. She kept on pushing herself closer to me. But as we kept on going, her behavior changed. So by the end of the walkthrough, which took about 1 hour, I think you're gonna notice big changes in her mood. Her mood changed and improved. She became happy. Her stress went down, and her physical and mental chatter relaxed. And as you can see, so in conclusion, unlike the commonly accepted definition that fear is only unpleasant, the evidence provide points to positive correlation between fear and positive outcomes. The research of the benefit of fear is in psych is still wide. You can find many research to show positive correlation to fear and positive emotion, but the research on fear as a form of entertainment is still new and still need more research. But even then, I think that one thing that my research proved is that before this led to this. Thank you. Any questions?
Awesome, Ayal. Very nice job. Those pictures at the end certainly drive the point home. Let's see. Do we have questions for Ayal? Do you see Jacob's comment?
No. I'm trying to figure out the layout. Okay.
He said it, he expected a jump scare slide in the presentation. I'm not seeing any questions. All right. Thank you so much, Ayal. Very nice job.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Nicholas Zira presenting on racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. And Nick, you look like you're all good to go.
Yep. Okay. Hello. My name is, oh, what?
I just said hi back.
Oh. All right. My name is Nick Zira, and focus of my capstone presentation was racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. Originally, my focus was going to be on mass incarceration due to the fact that despite having 5% of the world's population, the United States has 20% of the world's prison population. And it has 2.1 million people behind bars. But I changed my focus after learning through my research that 60% of the prison population is comprised of racial minorities. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how the criminal justice system has discriminated against racial minorities, what they have to go through during and after their sentences, as well as some possible solutions to these issues. Perhaps one of the greatest contributors to racial discrimination is the war on drugs. This is an initiative started by President Nixon in 1971 with the initial goal of reducing the amount of drugs consumed and distributed in the United States. While it's debatable whether that it has been successful at its goal, what it has led to is a federal prison population spike and a dramatic increase of drug arrests over 3 decades. And this is mainly due to the development of the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Now, these drugs aren't very different. Crack cocaine is just powder cocaine mixed with baking soda and water. And yet, despite this lack of a difference, in a law in 1986 made it so there was 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between the two. This means that somebody with arrested for 1 gram of crack cocaine would receive the same punishment as somebody with 100 grams of powder cocaine. Now, The reason this is racially discriminating is because of the demographics that make up the offenders. In 1994, 96% of crack offenses were comprised of minorities, while in the same year, only 74% of powder cocaine users were minorities. So the drug that is used more by whites has a significantly less punishment than crack cocaine. Now, fortunately, this disparity was reduced in 2010 from 100-1 to 18-1, but any disparity is evidence of racial discrimination, in my opinion. Not only has this disproportionately targeted minorities, it has fed into the misrepresentation that minorities use drugs at a higher rate than whites, which often contributes to racial profiling, which is another major way the criminal justice system discriminates. Racial profiling is when an officer investigates an individual based on the belief that their racial group is more likely to engage in a criminal activity than another racial group. And while drug law enforcement officers often defend this as a tool to apprehend and identify drug transporters, an analysis of the Washington State Patrol stops has shown that despite them searching Latinos and African American motorists more often than they searched white motorists that are stopped, they found white motorists were more likely to have contraband on them. Another problem with this thinking is that it's self-fulfilling in that if officers stop more minorities, under the belief that they commit more crimes, specifically drug crimes, then you will arrest more, thus feeding into the misinterpretation that minorities offend more often. During prison sentences, any healthy inmate must contribute into prison labor system. Within the system, there are 3 different types of labor: jobs that directly benefit prison operations. This is when inmates work, do other inmates' laundry, or clean floors, or work in mess halls, which is fine because they get paid for it and it directly makes their time there better. But then there is jobs that are done within the confines of the prison and is managed by the prison. This is where a lot of furniture is made and car parts are produced. And then there's work done outside the prison where the prison effectively just rents out inmates to do work for either the state or a private entity. And in these latter 2 forms of prison labor, it's rather it takes advantage of the prisoners as they aren't paid that much. As you can see, they're paid as little as 16 cents a day for 6 hours of work, 6 days a week. 6 days? Yes, 6 days a week. Also, prisoners are not covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which determines things like overtime pay and minimum wage. And often, for as little as these prisoners are paid, they often don't even receive what they earn, as they are faced with predatory deductions under the guise of taxes, victim restitution, and offsetting the cost of their own incarceration. After prison, their punishments don't stop either, as many ex-cons end up returning to prison after not being able to find jobs or housing. Normally, this is due to the constraints put on relations with families, and not being able to find jobs. You lose your connections due to the long stay in prison. And normally people who can't find jobs or housing would turn to social programs for help, but oftentimes ex-cons can't because drug convicts lose access to these, like public housing, civil service jobs, and just to add insult to injury, they often lose their voting rights as well. One of the solutions to these problems is education. I like this solution a lot because it kind of solves two birds with one stone. There is a education disparity between minorities and whites already without outside of prison. As you can see, in 2002, 43% of Latino adults had less than high school education. In the 2013 states sent more African American men to prison than to college. And with 60% of the prison population being minorities, by offering college programs and more educational programs, you can kind of reduce this disparity and help reduce recidivism, prisoners returning to prison. As shown, a study by the Graduate Center of New York showed that those who took college courses in prison were less likely to return to prison. Other solutions are obviously to completely eliminate the crack and cocaine sentencing disparity, to stop the use of racial profiling as a policing tool, possibly reserving prison labor jobs for ex-cons so they have a job and to pay them properly, and then to obviously not exclude ex-cons from public services. Thank you. Any questions?
Very nice job, Nick. Let's see, any questions for Nick? You did a very nice job, despite it sounds like you've got something funky going on in there.
Yeah, really dry. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
No questions? Well, let's see. Okay. Well, I'm going to do something that seems a little risky, but I'm going to unmute everybody so that we can give a collective round of applause, and hopefully it won't kill anyone's ears. Very nice job.
Good job, everybody.
Clapping.
Okay. Oh, we still have a question for Nick. So,
Look at the new gym.
so Rebecca, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, sorry, we could have skipped it. It seems,
That's all
you know,
right.
after the applause. Anyway, I didn't get to see all your bibliography, but what you're speaking about is very much in line with a lot of the in the, you know, recent, but I would call classic book, The New Jim Crow, about, you know, racial disparities and the use of imprisonment as social control for African American, especially men. I'm just curious if the New Jim Crow's a book. I'm just curious if this was something that Nick took a look at.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. No, I didn't take a look at it, though several of my sources did compare it to the original Jim Crow
Yeah.
situations we're going through.
Yeah, it just might be a book that you would really enjoy. So thank you. It's a really important topic.
Well, that concludes the 6th annual academic convivium for the first, hopefully not annual, Zoom academic convivium. I really want to thank everyone for joining us. At our peak, we had 83 people joining us. You guys, the student presenters, you were amazing. I don't think CEO Minkler would mind me telling you that after he got off, he had to go to a meeting and then to the PTK induction ceremony. He texted me and said that he was blown away by the quality of your presentations, as am I. You really outdid yourselves, and I'm really proud of you. I want to reiterate my thanks to Rich Lenosi and Todd Levesque. So helpful. Could not have done this without you. Thank you so much. I hope that you and your loved ones stay healthy and that we can see each other in person very soon. Thank you so much, everyone.